It's August 6, 2024. A small collective of around 300 Ukrainian troops crossed the border into Russia's Kursk region, and the war between Russia and Ukraine was changed forever. Those soldiers were the first of many who would flood over the northeastern border of Ukraine with Russia, taking territory and transforming the war. The Kursk invasion marked a monumental shift in strategy for Ukraine. For over 2.5 years, the country had dedicated itself to a valiant defense of its borders, throwing everything it had at stopping the Russian front line from pushing further in. Now it was on the offensive, an attack that reminded Russian President Vladimir Putin that Russia is far from the only country capable of invading another. To say Putin was taken by surprise would be an understatement. Humiliated by the Kursk invasion, he had to face up to the fact that he had failed to protect his homeland while bombarding another country. Even as of this script's writing, 500 square miles of Kursk are still in Ukrainian hands, with Putin's promised response of 30,000 soldiers to repel the invaders either yet to materialize or being incapable of shifting the Ukrainians from their new position. Still, at least Putin could console himself with the thought that this would be the only Ukrainian invasion of Russian territory. The element of surprise had worked well once, but he would be prepared if Ukraine tried to do it again. All he has to do now is push Ukraine's forces out of Kursk, and he can get back to war as normal. Putin wouldn't be fooled again, surely. He would, and he has been, as Ukraine is following up the Kursk invasion with a second invasion that will see it take as much territory in Russia as Putin's forces hold in Ukraine. So how did this all start? Reports started surfacing of an invasion into Belgorod on August 27, 2024, with multiple outlets appearing to confirm it had happened. One of those outlets was Times Radio, a British radio station hosted by the Times news media outlet, which invited former British military intelligence officer Philip Ingram onto the show to discuss the attacks. He revealed what we knew as of August 27th. What we know so far is that the Ukrainians seem to have attacked with 300 troops into one border crossing, and there are unconfirmed reports of another 200 troops in another border crossing point. This would put the total invading Ukrainian force at around 500, which is similar to the 300 or so that was initially reported for the Kursk invasion. In that case, the 300 or so, backed by armored vehicles and tanks, were quickly able to overwhelm the border checkpoints leading into Kursk, opening the way for more Ukrainian troops to pour into the Russian oblast. Perhaps Zelensky is hoping to repeat that success by using a small contingent to blow the border checkpoints leading into Belgorod to clear the way for more troops to enter. That remains to be seen. Other news outlets offer conflicting reports. On August 27th, the Kyiv Post reported that the pro-Kremlin Telegram channel shot that 60 Ukrainian soldiers, along with 8 armored vehicles, had launched an invasion operation near the Belgorod village of Neativka at 8 a.m. That was followed by a report by the MASH Telegram channel, which refuted these claims and said that it was more like 200 Ukrainian troops moving with several infantry vehicles. The same Telegram channel also notes that a further 300 Ukrainians were fighting with Russian soldiers at Shebekino, which is one of the border checkpoints into Belgorod previously mentioned. These MASH reports seem to align more closely with the numbers Ingram quotes, with the likelihood being that the shot channel either has inaccurate information or was attempting to downplay the invasion due to its links to the Kremlin. Either way, confusion reigned, just as it did when Ukraine invaded Kursk. Vyacheslav Gladkov, who serves as the Belgorod Oblast's regional governor, quickly took to Telegram to try to downplay the talk of an invasion. Information has emerged that the enemy is trying to break through the border of the Belgorod region. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, the situation at the border remains difficult but under control. Later on, that control was demonstrated when Gladkov posted a Telegram message saying that Ukraine had started to conduct shelling and drone attacks on 3 villages in the Belgorod Oblast. Some of that shelling took place in Petrovka, which is 6 miles away from the Neativka checkpoint, suggesting that Ukraine had broken through the checkpoints and was in the process of capturing territory. If you remember the early days of the Kursk invasion, you might already notice some parallels. An invading force of around 300 or maybe more, and Russian claims that the situation was under control even as it became clear that Ukraine was breaking through. Of course, the reality was much different, with Ukraine ending up entering Kursk easily before it began a rampage of territory taking that has seen it firmly entrench itself in Russian territory. Perhaps we're about to see the same in Belgorod. Reuters also reported on the developing Belgorod invasion, noting that it wasn't able to independently verify any of the reports found on Telegram. However, it did quote a Russian military blog named Operation Z, which has 1.6 million subscribers, as claiming there had been no real Ukrainian attempt to break through. There were clashes with Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups, and Russian artillery is working, the blog claimed. No large-scale attempts to break through have been recorded. Perhaps not. But then, the Kursk invasion wasn't large-scale, at least at first, and Operation Z's claims seemed to directly conflict with Gladkov's confirmation that Ukraine had launched shelling and drone attacks on several villages in Belgorod. So the situation remains unclear, but it seems likely that Ukraine has at least attempted to enter Belgorod, with some other reports suggesting that it succeeded to some extent. As Ingram points out, what we might be seeing right now is Phase 2 of a wider invasion effort, with Kursk being Phase 1, that's designed to allow Ukraine to capture at least as much territory in Russia as Russia holds in Ukraine. But here's the most notable thing. This latest invasion is far from the first time that Ukraine has attacked Belgorod. In May 2023, The Guardian reported on a Russian warplane dropping a bomb on a busy city. That sort of occurrence has sadly become commonplace during the Ukraine war. The bomb exploded successfully, leaving a 65-foot crater while ripping up the road and sending debris flying in all directions. It was such a powerful blast that it launched a car onto the roof of a shop, though the strike ultimately ended up killing no one. But there was something different about this bomb. Yes, it had been dropped from a Russian plane, but the bomb, which was launched on April 21, 2023, struck a Russian city, Belgorod. About a month after dropping that bomb, the reason for the Russian warplane being used was made clear. May 22, 2023 saw two Russian rebel groups, the Russian Volunteer Corps, or RVC, and the Freedom of Russia Legion, or FRL, launch a cross-border raid from Ukraine into Belgorod. Both are pro-Ukrainian groups, with the raid supposedly resulting in them taking control of several settlements near the border before they were ultimately driven out by Russian government forces. Similar raids took place in June 2023, which the RVC dubbed as the second phase of its efforts, a phase that saw them being joined by the Terror Battalion out of Belarus, with the goal of the raid being to draw Russian soldiers away from other parts of the Ukraine war's front lines, while inspiring a spirit of rebellion against Putin. The craziest thing is that the May and June 2023 invasions carried out by Russian rebel groups aren't the only warning shots that have been fired in Belgorod's direction. May 6, 2024 brought with it news of a Ukrainian air attack on the Belgorod region that left 7 people dead and a further 35 people injured. Gladkov claimed that the attack involved the use of drones, with the target apparently being a meat production facility in the village of Beryozovka. That strike followed one that took place in December 2023, which killed 25 and injured a further 100 in the oblast's main city of Belgorod. Point here is that Putin has seen a Belgorod invasion happen before. And yet he was still clearly unprepared for the August 2024 invasion. Ukraine has made it clear, time and again, that Belgorod is a target, yet Putin was caught with his pants down by the latest invasion, with the failure of his border checkpoints to keep several hundred Ukrainian invaders at bay, resulting in several of the region's villages being forced to endure shelling and drone strikes. So we come to a question: why is Ukraine targeting Belgorod? A possible answer may lie in the region's importance to Russia. AP News reports that Belgorod is an oblast that shares a 335-mile border with Ukraine. The region is characterized by farmlands and rolling hills, with its population of 1.5 million being spread over 10,500 square miles. But perhaps crucially, Belgorod is also home to several major Russian industrial companies, with the region producing around 40% of the iron ore that Russia uses to forge its war machine. Perhaps Ukrainian attempts to take Belgorod are designed to cut off Russian access to its iron, as well as the food produced by Belgorod's farmlands. If nothing else, Ukraine invading deeper into the oblast will allow it to disrupt the logistics needed to transport these goods to the rest of Russia, placing Putin further into a material crisis that's already seen him pull World War II-era tanks out of storage to continue his assaults on Ukraine. However, to create that disruption, Ukraine would have to take a substantial amount of Belgorod. Certainly more than the 500 or so troops believed to have taken part in the border crossings would be capable of taking. So a far more likely reason for the Belgorod invasion is that Ukraine is looking to expand its influence within Russia by taking yet more territory out of Putin's hands. That's according to Ingram, who tells Times Radio that he believes Ukraine is trying to use Belgorod, along with Kursk, to establish a buffer zone on its northern borders that it can later use to negotiate with Russia. What seems to be happening, and I'm speculating a little here with a lack of information, is that the Ukrainians are going to try to take over a sort of buffer zone inside Russia along its northern border, claims Ingram. That buffer zone will ideally equate to the same amount of territory Russia holds in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's forces are already making good progress in that regard. As of September 4, 2024, Ukraine holds around 386 square miles of territory inside Kursk. There are no reports yet of how much territory it's taken in Belgorod, though the fact that it's launched several attacks on villages 6 miles away from near Tivka suggests that the number may be close to 400 square miles. Let's compare that to Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine. Following his initial failed attempt to take Kyiv in a smash-and-grab raid, after which his forces were pushed back substantially, Putin has settled into waging a war of attrition. Territorial gains have been slow, but they have come, albeit on the back of a meat grinder that's seen Russia lose over 620,000 soldiers, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. 2.5 years of fighting has seen Russia take control of around 18% of Ukraine, which amounts to nearly 42,000 square miles. Perhaps that means Ingram's claims of Ukraine attempting to take an equivalent amount of territory in Russia that Russia holds in Ukraine are a little ambitious. However, his comments make more sense when you consider Russia's gains throughout 2024. Much of the territory Putin holds is territory his forces captured during the early months of the war. Since then, progress has been slow. For instance, Reuters reports that Russia has seized just 211 square miles of Ukraine between January and the beginning of May 2024. For those keeping score, that's about half of what Ukraine has seized in just 1 month of its invasion of Russia. So Zelensky is showing that his forces can make equivalent or better progress than Putin's in a much shorter time frame, with the clear threat being that Ukraine can take even more territory to create the buffer zone Ingram references. Why would having this buffer zone matter? There are 2 reasons. First, Kursk and Belgorod haven't been chosen for the Ukrainian invasion simply because they're border regions that Ukraine can enter easily. Both are regions that Ukraine believes have been responsible for launching missile and shelling attacks on Ukrainian cities, meaning taking territory in those oblasts would make it harder for Russia to attack Ukraine from the north, hence the buffer zone. By maintaining this zone, Ukraine keeps Russia further away from its northern lands, perhaps enabling it to place a greater focus on defending Donetsk, that's been Putin's clear target throughout 2024 and for much of 2023. The second reason comes down to negotiation. As Ingram points out in his interview with Times Radio, that could be Zelensky's endgame. Ingram says Zelensky may use the Belgorod and Kursk invasions to turn around and say, "You've got some of my stuff, and I've got some of your stuff. We either agree to keep what we've got, or we agree to give it back." In other words, Zelensky may use the territory Ukraine has captured in Kursk and Belgorod to create a trade with Putin. That trade won't result in Putin giving up the full 18% of the territory Russia currently holds in Ukraine. But if Zelensky can regain the several hundred square miles Ukraine has lost since the beginning of 2024, he's achieved a massive coup. All of Russia's losses so far this year would have been for nothing. And if the trade doesn't go through, Zelensky can dedicate more Ukrainian resources to the invasion, capturing even more Russian territory while placing even greater pressure on Putin. And pressure brings us to another of the reasons why Ukraine is invading Belgorod. With this second invasion, Ukraine piles on the pressure Putin is facing in the wake of the Kursk invasion. That pressure is starting to come from his own people, who are being forced to confront the realities of what war with Ukraine looks like when that war is brought to their doorstep. On August 14th, just 13 days before Ukraine's Belgorod invasion, the region was already placed under a state of emergency. At the time, Gladkov claimed that Ukrainian attacks meant that houses are destroyed, civilians died and were injured, though the veracity of these claims is in question. What isn't in question is that Putin is already facing backlash from his citizens over the whole affair. We can see this in Kursk. On August 8th, just 2 days after Ukraine invaded the oblast, CNN reported on several residents in Kursk's Sudansky district sending pleading messages to Putin via Telegram. The address features several people, one of whom claimed that the statements being released by Russia's Ministry of Defense about the invasion were false. "These lies enable the local residents to die," said the resident. "The chief of the general staff recently told you the situation is under control, but today huge furious battles are underway in the Sudansky and Koronevsky districts," they claimed. Another resident kept it simpler. "Sudza was attacked, turned into ruins in a matter of hours. Local administration wasn't working." Reading between the lines of these messages, we can see that Putin's citizens are losing faith in him. Those in Kursk who've experienced the full force of Ukraine's fury are not only terrified, but being forced to deal with Putin offering a slow response while their local governments lie to them. What they can see with their eyes overrides the propaganda being put out by Russia's defense ministry, and that pressure from Putin's own people is being reflected in pressure applied by his political allies. In September 2024, a Russian member of parliament named Yevgeny Fedorov struck back at the Kremlin's official propaganda, which continues to claim that Russia has the Ukrainian invasion under control. Fedorov leads Russia's national liberation movement and is a key voice in arguing for the territorial integrity of the Russian state. The Kursk governor announced that 10 more villages have been evacuated. "If there is no offensive, why evacuate the villages?" Fedorov asked in a Telegram post. The same question could be asked for Belgorod. If Russia has that invasion under control, then why is it proclaiming a state of emergency in the oblast? The reason is that Putin is trying to relieve the pressure. Fedorov also cited Kremlin propaganda, claiming that the invasions were the last dash from the grave for Ukraine's forces, marking the comments as ridiculous, while pointing out that Kurchatov, which is a city in Kursk that lies 70 miles away from Ukraine's border, has been closed. Again, why do that if there's no threat of Ukraine attacking the city? It all adds up to more pressure being placed on Putin. The Kremlin is trying to lie its way out of the invasion, telling the Russian people to ignore the very real evidence of an invasion that's before their very eyes. With the second invasion into Belgorod, Ukraine is making it even harder for the Kremlin to spread its lies, allowing it to chip away at Putin's power base in his own country in the process. Putin's inability to defend his own people is being exposed, and that brings us to another reason why Ukraine has launched an attack on Belgorod. It's showing the world that Russia's military isn't as powerful as Putin would like to have people believe. Ingram points this out in his interview with Times Radio. Given the fact that Ukrainians attacked Belgorod twice in the last year, the Russians should have been more prepared for an attack there, he says, referencing the Ukrainian strikes that took place earlier in 2024. If the Ukrainians make significant advances, it shows that the Russians are in a much worse state than we'd ever thought beforehand. This is an important point. Putin's position as Russia's president is predicated on his ability to project a strongman image to both his people and the rest of the world. That image was holding up pretty well before the Ukraine war and into its early months. The concept of red lines, which are the lines Ukraine's allies believed they couldn't cross because they would provoke Russian aggression, became a hot topic. Fear was the name of Putin's game. Russia was one of the world's largest militaries, the narrative went, and Ukraine's allies should keep away if they don't want to feel its full force. The problem for Putin is that the Kursk and Belgorod invasions represent the last red line that Ukraine could cross. It's already receiving weapons from Western allies. It has permission to use many of those weapons inside Russia. Ukraine even has F-16s. Now it's fighting Russian soldiers inside Russia, taking territory as it does, and Putin has yet to muster a proper response, never mind unleash the level of military aggression most believe would come. Now the red lines have shifted once again. Russia, and Putin by proxy, is still trying to position itself as a major threat. As recently as September 4th, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told reporters that the US has found itself being egged on by Zelensky, that they should understand they are joking about red lines here. They shouldn't joke about our red lines. But most of those red lines have already been crossed. Putin has done nothing about it, which only lends credence to the prevailing thought that, for all of Russia's might on paper, its military is poorly trained and far less capable than many believed. After all, this is a military that's losing around 1,000 people per day in Donetsk to take small scraps of territory, while, to Ukraine's north, it's losing a lot more ground on its own turf. And that brings us to another reason that Ukraine has launched its Belgorod invasion. It gives Putin something to think about. That was one of the main reasons behind the Kursk invasion after all. Putin has diverted at least 30,000 troops to that region in an effort to get rid of the Ukrainian invaders. The number may even be as high as 60,000, according to Zelensky, who told NBC News at the beginning of September that the idea and one of the goals of the Kursk Oblast operation was diverting Russian troops to their territory. The Belgorod invasion likely has similar goals. Zelensky is stretching the front lines of the war, pulling them into Russian territory to relieve the pressure his forces are feeling in Donetsk. Whether that strategy is going to work remains to be seen. But if nothing else, the Belgorod invasion gives Putin yet another thing to think about while he's still struggling to deal with the Kursk invasion. He now has to fight Ukrainians in 2 Russian territories, forcing changes in strategy that he didn't want to make. And all of this brings us to the final reason Ukraine launched the Belgorod invasion. By moving into Russian territory, Zelensky has snatched the initiative of the Ukraine war out of Putin's hands. That's according to Ingram, who noted the initiative issue when referring to a series of missile and drone strikes that killed 4 people during Ukraine's Independence Day on August 24th. Ingram says that part of the reason for launching those attacks was for Putin to try and say to the Russian people and his international supporters that he still has the initiative when, in reality, he doesn't, because the Ukrainians have regained it via their attacks in Kursk and elsewhere. For perhaps the first time since the Ukraine war began, Putin has been forced into a reactive mode, where he's trying to deal with Ukrainian attacks rather than being the aggressor. You could argue that he entered that mode during the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, though the key difference there comes in advanced warning. Putin knew the counteroffensive was being planned. He had months to prepare as a result, but he had no idea that Kursk was coming, and now, with Belgorod being invaded, he's been caught off guard again. Even as Russia continues to bombard Donetsk, it's Ukraine that holds more of the cards in this conflict. Still, there are issues that Ukraine has to consider going forward. Speaking to NBC News on September 3rd, Zelensky said that Ukraine plans to hold the territory it's taken in Kursk. "We don't need their land. We don't want to bring our Ukrainian way of life there," Zelensky said before saying, "For now we need it as part of his push toward a victory plan." You have to assume he will take the same approach to any land that Ukraine captures in Belgorod. The ongoing challenge for the Ukrainian army will lie in ensuring that it has enough soldiers in place to keep the territory it's taken. There's a possibility that Zelensky may stretch his own forces too thin while attempting to force Putin to do the same. After all, Ingram believes that Ukraine has already reached its limit of exploitation within Russia, meaning it's reached the limit of the amount of territory it can take in Kursk and Belgorod with the number of soldiers it has in the country. To take more, Zelensky will have to send additional troops. He'll also need to replenish the numbers of those lost to Russian counteroffensives. Given that Russia is still trying to progress in Donetsk, that could place Ukraine in the dangerous position of trying to hold Kursk and Belgorod while it's losing land elsewhere. Still, for now at least, Putin has once again been left with egg on his face. The Kursk invasion showed that Russia's military was woefully unprepared for the mere concept of Ukraine launching an attack on Russian territory. With Belgorod, Ukraine has not only wrested the initiative further out of Putin's hands, but it has shown his inability to adapt. Putin was caught unaware for a second time. Will there be a third, a fourth? How many times will the Russian people put up with a leader who has repeatedly shown that he has no plan in place to defend them against the consequences of his own aggression? It was a gamble unlike any that we've seen so far in the Ukraine war. On August 6th, Ukraine sent a small contingent of soldiers into the Russian region of Kursk. Early reports suggested that anywhere between 300 and 1,000 soldiers had crossed the border, having broken through the poorly defended Russian fortifications on the front lines to make the journey. Since then, Ukraine has kept pushing. Its soldiers continue to move through Kursk, with some even making their way to Belgorod, and the entire complexion of the Ukraine war has changed. For the first time, Russia is being forced to defend itself on its own territory, a situation that seemed unfathomable in February 2022, when the entire world was shaken by President Vladimir Putin and his special military operation. Ever since that Kursk invasion, there's been a key question circulating in the media and among Ukraine's allies. Why? Ukraine's capture of Russian territory in Kursk isn't so much about holding Russian land as it is about changing Russia's entire approach to the war. After all, it's forced Putin to pull troops out of vital areas in Ukraine to defend Russia, which is a situation that will only benefit Ukraine as the war takes its next dramatic turn. But before we get into Russia and Putin's decision to pull his units out of Ukraine, let's dig a little deeper into what's happening in Kursk right now. In an interview with the BBC on August 13th, a Ukrainian soldier named Tomasz explained some of what happened on August 6th. "We had orders to come here, but we didn't know what they meant," he said while drinking coffee at a gas station inside Kursk. Those orders were surprisingly simple. The evening of August 6th saw a small contingent of Ukrainian troops cross the border between Ukraine and Russia, entering the region of Kursk. Since then, the Ukrainians have advanced rapidly. Those early incursions saw it seize 28 settlements, as confirmed by Russia's Ministry of Defense, as well as the Sudza gas metering station. Owned by Gazprom, which is Russia's largest energy supplier, that station transmits Russian natural gas to the rest of Europe. It's a key part of the country's European energy infrastructure, and now it's under Ukrainian control. Though, as Gazprom itself claims, the emerging satellite imagery of damage to the station doesn't mean that Ukraine has destroyed it. Yet. "We suppressed the enemy's means of communication and surveillance in advance to clear the way," continued Tomasz, who remarked that the entire operation was far simpler than he would have thought. Those comments have been echoed in photos and video footage that have started emerging on the Telegram social media platform in the days since the initial invasion. One such video shows a soldier who claims that months of planning went into the operation, with its goal being to force Russia to move troops to other parts of the front lines. "The element of surprise worked," claims the soldier in the clip. "We entered easily, with little resistance. On August 6th, the first groups crossed at night in several directions. Russia's poorly manned defenses on the border couldn't stop these initial groups. What followed was nothing short of a remarkable Ukrainian advancement into Russian territory. That initial group of 1,000 is now believed to be growing in number, though reports are starting to conflict one another." On August 13th, the BBC noted that Ukraine's President Zelensky is now claiming that Ukraine holds 74 settlements in Kursk. Russia's defense ministry hasn't commented since its initial confirmation that 28 settlements had been overrun, meaning there's little reason to doubt Ukraine's claims. Whatever the case may be, it doesn't change the fact that Ukraine now controls villages and towns inside Russian territory. It's a sharp humiliation for Putin that also changes the entire complexion of the war. Ukraine is also claiming that it now controls about 386 square miles of Russian territory in Kursk, though the BBC says that is a disputed claim. The Institute for the Study of War, for example, says that while Ukrainian soldiers may be spread out that far, it's unlikely that the entire region is under the Ukrainian army's complete control. What is more certain is that Russian civilians are fleeing Kursk in droves. The BBC says that 121,000 have left their homes so far, many on their way to Moscow to escape the war that's coming to their doorstep. A further 180,000 have been told they need to leave, meaning Ukraine's invasion has forced the temporary displacement of nearly 200,000 Russian civilians in the space of a week. Moscow is preparing to welcome as many of those people as possible, having set up 400 shelters across the country that will serve as makeshift homes for up to 30,000 evacuees. But it's clear that the scale of the escape from Kursk is growing beyond Moscow's control. It barely has enough shelters to handle a sixth of the people who've been displaced so far. All of this implies that the Kursk offensive has been extremely successful so far. But that success doesn't answer the question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why did Ukraine choose to launch its invasion now? It's not about taking territory, at least according to Ukraine's foreign ministry. On the afternoon of August 13th, a claim came out that Ukraine was not interested in taking territory, with the supposed goal being broader than that. A spokesperson for the ministry said, "The sooner Russia agrees to restore a just peace, the sooner Ukrainian raids on Russian territory will stop. As long as Putin continues the war, he will receive such responses from Ukraine." So the Kursk invasion is actually about bringing an end to the entire war then? Perhaps it is, in part, but there's a far more immediate and practical reason for Zelensky taking such a massive gamble. Ukrainian troops invading Kursk will force Russia to deploy soldiers it has stationed elsewhere to deal with them, and that action will have a far greater impact on the war than many realize. We're already seeing this happen. On August 13th, a week after the Kursk invasion began, Politico ran an article in which it reported on the comments of Ukrainian army spokesperson Dmytro Likovy. He claimed that the invasion had left Moscow scrambling, forcing Putin to not only express anger, but claim that the West was responsible for the invasion. The Russian president claims that Russia will mount a worthy response to Ukraine's actions, with that response appearing to be pulling troops out of other locations to send to Kursk. Russia has relocated some of its units from both the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions of Ukraine's south, Likovy claims. This move is notable because those regions were among the first that Russia attacked when Putin launched his special military operation in February 2022. Kherson in particular was a major early victory for Russia. Symbolically, it was the first major Ukrainian city to fall to the Russian invasion, allowing Putin to proclaim an early victory in his operation. But perhaps more important is Kherson's location. With a population of 380,000 people, Kherson lies on the banks of the Dnipro River, giving Russia key access to the city via the Black Sea. In the early days of the war, this access was seen as vital. Russia's dreaded Black Sea Fleet will be able to send soldiers and supplies into Kherson via Crimea, allowing Putin to reinforce his armies in South Ukraine. Of course, we now know that the war hasn't played out quite like that, with Ukraine managing to use missiles and drone strikes to take out a third of the Black Sea Fleet. That part of the fleet wasn't rendered completely useless, but Russia is far warier about using it now than it was when it first took Kherson. Still, this proximity to Crimea is important to both sides. For Russia, it's due to the logistical advantages, and for Ukraine, because Kherson acts as a sort of gateway to the annexed territory. Crimea has been under Russian control since 2014, with taking back Crimea likely being a key objective for Ukraine in the war. Kherson is important in that, as Dr. Marina Miron, who researches defense studies at the King's College London, explains, recapturing it would pave the way to reconquering Crimea, which Ukraine aims to do in this war. Back to the city's importance, Kherson offers access to the Dnipro River, a waterway that runs right into the center of Ukraine. Again, that river could serve as a major supply line for Russia as it advances closer to Kyiv from the south. Why does any of this matter in the context of Kursk? Russia removing troops from Kherson means that it's prioritizing the protection of its own territory over the retaking of important territory in Ukraine. It weakens the assaults Russia can carry out on a key Ukrainian city, and one that Russia controlled in the early months of the war, allowing Ukraine to refortify Kherson so it becomes much harder for Russia to retake once it's resolved the Kursk issue. However, it's unknown just how many troops Russia has redeployed. Likovy suggests that Russia has moved a relatively small number of soldiers from Kherson to Kursk, meaning there will still be Russian forces in the city. That could be a miscalculation by Putin. Though Ukraine invaded Kursk with a small number of soldiers itself, as around 1,000 crossed the border, those soldiers have succeeded by creating anarchy in the oblast. Roving units are destroying Russian defenses at small settlements, followed by larger units of Ukrainian troops that secure those settlements and fortify them. A relatively small number of Russian soldiers isn't likely to be able to dislodge the Ukrainian soldiers from their positions quickly. Plus, now that Ukraine has broken through to Kursk, nothing is stopping it from reinforcing those positions it's taken with soldiers of its own. In short, the Kursk invasion has forced Putin into a change of tactics. However, it may not have forced the change that Ukraine wanted. While troops moving out of Kherson is important, Ukraine would have preferred Russia to move soldiers away from the Donetsk region. Al Jazeera said as much in a video published on August 12th, in which it claimed that the invasions of Kursk and Belgorod were intended to change the dynamics in Donetsk by forcing Russia to send troops from that region. That would relieve some pressure on Ukrainian forces stationed in and around that city, which have faced constant bombardment as Russia attempts to secure more territory in the Donbass. But Donetsk remains in Russia's focus. Back in February 2024, Reuters reported that Russia was firing anywhere between 1,500 and 2,500 rockets and artillery shells at the war-torn city daily, with its goal being to take out key infrastructure before winter in hopes of forcing more of the city's population out by the end of the year. Ukraine is trying to hold Russia back in the eastern province. Russia currently holds about 57% of Donetsk, but the constant pressure has been telling. Ukraine wanted to ease that pressure. However, Putin's response of pulling soldiers out of Kherson suggests that won't happen. As Politico points out, Russia has instead tried to counter Ukraine's gains by launching refreshed offensives in Pokrovsk, which is in the Donetsk region, alongside other locations in Donetsk. For now, Russia seems satisfied with pulling troops out of Kherson, along with sending troops from Kaliningrad into Kursk. That's according to Laurynas Kasčiūnas, the Lithuanian defense minister, who claims that Lithuania has spotted Russian troops leaving Kaliningrad in the wake of the Kursk invasion. All of this adds up to a fairly confused response on the part of Russia. Likovy said as much when speaking to Ukrainian TV, noting that Russia launched several attacks on Kherson, even as it withdrew some of its forces to send to Kursk. "We must still understand whether it's a smokescreen activity," he noted. But trying to create a smokescreen could backfire on Putin. If the army is only diverting small numbers of troops to tackle the Kursk problem, with the focus remaining on the Donetsk and Kherson regions, Russia may find itself losing even more territory. A small contingent isn't going to stop Ukraine's advance, especially given how meager the Russian defenses were initially. Those small numbers of troops will run into far stronger Ukrainian fortifications, as well as having to deal with the potential for Ukraine to send more soldiers into Kursk, so these former Kherson units are attacked from both sides. Only one thing is certain: Putin has been forced to change his approach to the Ukraine war. For the first time since the war began, he's not fighting on his own terms. Instead, he's having to respond to a successful Ukrainian offensive that has brought the war into Russia. Regardless of the nature of his response, this is something that Putin neither anticipated nor prepared for, meaning that he's been humiliated as Ukraine shows he hasn't done enough to defend the Russian people. Let's focus back on Kherson for a bit. Though the removal of troops from that pivotal city may seem like a huge bond for Ukraine, the reality is that Russia had already done something similar back in November 2022. Several months after taking Kherson, Putin ordered the withdrawal of many of his soldiers stationed in the city as they stared down a Ukrainian counterattack that they likely wouldn't be able to handle. Ukraine successfully liberated the city 9 months after it was taken. However, Kherson was far from a secure area following this liberation. As AP News reported, in November 2022, the departing Russian forces littered the city's streets with landmines that one Ukrainian official noted could render Kherson a city of death. Mikhailo Podolyak made those claims, and another that would turn out to be prescient. Russia would start shelling Kherson intensely after it relocated its troops to the other side of the Dnipro River. That's exactly what happened. As CNN reported in February 2024, the successful liberation of Kherson by Ukraine didn't result in the city becoming a safe haven for its people or a location from which Ukraine could organize attacks against Russian positions in the south. The shelling that Podolyak predicted soon came, with residents describing the level of drones and artillery pounding away at the city to be at the worst levels they'd seen since the beginning of the war. The Dnipro riverside is now lined with trenches, and the endless storm of artillery has left Kherson a broken husk, where broken glass and destroyed buildings line the streets. Pessimism has reigned in Kherson for 2 years. CNN reports that repair workers have taken to making dark jokes, with one saying his team celebrated the 10,000th window they'd boarded up in the wake of the Russian attacks. Kherson may not have become the city of death that Podolyak envisioned in terms of Russian landmines, but Russia has spent almost the entire war ensuring that the city would have no chance of recovery following its forced withdrawal in November 2022. All of which brings us back to the Kursk invasion. Perhaps now we're starting to see more of Ukraine's strategy crystallizing. Zelensky made a huge gamble when he okayed the Kursk invasion. He bet that Russia would be able to do little to stop his soldiers from entering Russian territory and, crucially, that he wouldn't face any blowback from the West for taking the war into Russian territory. The gamble paid off. Ukraine is in Russia, and the West isn't telling Zelensky that his soldiers need to leave. The success of that gamble has forced Putin to rethink his strategy. That's evident in the troop diversions we've spoken of. Russia is weakening its position in Kherson to send troops into Kursk. That's ideal for Zelensky, as Ukraine only intends to hold Russian territory for as long as is needed to achieve its own aims. With Russian soldiers leaving Kherson, perhaps now could be a time for Ukraine to consolidate its position in that city properly and prepare to defend it against future Russian attacks. There's also the Donetsk region to consider. Yes, Zelensky would have liked to see Russian soldiers diverted from that region in response to the Kursk invasion, but that hasn't happened. Yet. Given that we don't know just how many soldiers Putin is sending to Kursk, it's still very possible that Ukraine could fend off the initial Russian response, forcing Russia to divert troops from elsewhere. If Zelensky's luck holds out, that elsewhere could be Donetsk, which would again afford Ukraine time to not only refortify, but to potentially launch counterattacks against weakened Russian forces. But Ukraine may have had other goals with the Kursk invasion. Disrupting Russian logistics could be one of them. As part of the newest invasion, Ukraine has seized a key Russian gas transmission station. It's also taking territory through which Russia might have sent reinforcements into Donetsk. Now around 200,000 people are being evacuated from Kursk, with the region becoming far less useful to Putin. As the Kyiv Independent points out, the incursion could also halt cross-border attacks from Kursk, allowing Ukrainian soldiers to not only regroup but also redeploy closer to Donetsk to shore up Ukraine's defenses. That means 2 more goals may have been achieved. Even if Russian soldiers aren't pulled from Donetsk, Ukraine has made it much more difficult for Russia to send reinforcements into the region. And with Russia now trying to retake Kursk, rather than fight Ukraine on its own territory in the north, Ukraine can send more soldiers to Donetsk. If nothing else, the invasion has forced a stretching of the front lines. That's according to ABC News, which wrote that Zelensky's decision to invade Kursk was a bold gamble, given that he was encroaching on the territory of a nuclear-armed country. A country that's made multiple threats to use tactical nukes in Ukraine. Those threats haven't come to fruition, with Putin only able to muster a meager response to the Ukrainian incursion. Evacuations and troop diversions, rather than a nuclear holocaust, have been the results. That's yet another way that Zelensky's big gamble has paid off. It's shown that crossing the final red line and invading Russia doesn't come with the repercussions that Putin claimed it would. Whatever happens in Kursk from this point forth, Ukraine has achieved a symbolic victory against Putin. It's demonstrated that there is a far lighter bite behind the Russian president's nuclear barking, which opens the door for future incursions into Russian territory. It also shows the rest of Europe that Ukraine is still worth backing in this war, and that Russia may not present the level of threat many believed it did in the past. A chink in Putin's armor has been revealed, with the strongman of Russian politics being shown as somebody who doesn't always back up his word. That's not the only chink that Zelensky's gamble revealed. The mere fact that Ukraine was able to launch the Kursk invasion in the first place shows the strategic weakness of the Russian approach to the war. So focused was Putin on achieving his objectives in Donetsk that he failed to secure the front lines in North Ukraine. Arrogance may have played a part here. Putin likely didn't anticipate that Ukraine would even consider an invasion into Kursk or any other Russian territory, leading him to dedicating just enough to the northern front lines to occupy Ukraine in its own territory. That approach has clearly backfired. With Ukrainian forces now in Kursk, the war's front lines have been expanded and stretched, with the result being what we're currently seeing. Russia is having to weaken its positions elsewhere to handle the Kursk problem. Of course, there's a wrinkle to this strategy. Stretching the front lines has just as much of an impact on Ukraine as it does on Russia. Ukraine's commander of the 14th Regiment of Unmanned Drones, identified only through his code name of Charlie by ABC, says as much. The stretching of the front line for us is also stretching the front line for the enemy, he claims. Only we have prepared for this operation in detail. The Russians were not prepared for this operation at all. In other words, Ukraine has accounted for the impact the stretching of the front lines will have. A metaphorical stacking of the deck in Zelensky's big gamble, resulting in the front line expansion working out in Ukraine's favor. There's another way that Zelensky's big gamble has proven to be a strategic masterstroke. It's resulted in the capture of several hundred Russian conscripts, many of whom were only recently installed in Putin's army. That's according to the live tracker Sky News has put in place following the initial Kursk invasion. On August 15th, it reported on claims from Zelensky that Ukraine had captured around 100 Russian prisoners of war during the previous 24 hours, with many dozens more having been caught between August 6th and 13th. That represents a more literal weakening of Russia's front line, as those are soldiers who will no longer be able to fight against Ukraine. Russia will have to replace those captured conscripts, which creates another explanation on why it's diverting troops away from Kherson and other regions to send to Kursk. Finally, there's the major propaganda victory Ukraine has achieved as a result of its Kursk invasion. On August 15th, Sky News published a report on the captured Russians, in which its reporters actually spoke to some of those who'd been captured. It described the detainees as generally being young conscripts, many aged between 19 and 21, who had absolutely no idea how to respond when Ukraine invaded. The men, who were unnamed and now shown in pictures, said that Ukraine's attack happened extremely quickly and they simply surrendered rather than fighting back. They claimed their families had no idea what had happened to them, with some expressing hope that their capture would lead to a prisoner exchange at some point. That's damaging to Putin in several ways. As Sky News points out, he said at several points during the war that conscripts wouldn't be sent near the front lines until they were more experienced.
These captures refute that claim. Most people to whom Sky News spoke were young men recently conscripted and placed in vulnerable positions. Not only does this make Putin look like a liar, but it exposes weaknesses in his army. Are Russia's manpower issues so severe that it's being forced to use barely trained conscripts as the first line of defense against Ukrainian forces? The Kursk invasion would certainly suggest so. Worse yet for Putin, his reputation as a strongman has been damaged. That's according to Sky News security and defense editor Deborah Haynes, who says that it's become impossible for Putin to hide this invasion from the Russian people. For a politician, a former spy, who has spent his career building a reputation of being a strongman, to have his country invaded in this way, it must be a huge blow to President Putin. All of this leads us to a final question. What happens next? That question is difficult to answer. The odds seem high that Ukraine is going to fortify its positions in Kursk, ready to fight against the troops that Putin is diverting from Kherson. That fortification could result in more Russian losses, leading to more troop diversions. The longer Ukraine can hold the 74 settlements it's taken in Kursk, the more time it gives itself to take advantage of the stretching of the front lines. That could open the door for more counteroffensives in Donetsk, assuming Putin is forced to divert troops from this critical region, as well as the fortification of Kursk and the countering of artillery strikes that have battered the city for so long. All that being said, Kursk wasn't the objective. It was a gamble played to perfection by Zelensky that's completely changed the layout of the war. Putin is now being forced to respond while facing the humiliation of being the first Russian leader since World War II to allow another country to invade Russian territory. In the end, the damage the Kursk invasion has caused to Putin may be just as valuable as the forcing of troops to relocate. But what do you think? What are the long-term ramifications of Ukraine's invasion of Kursk, and what do you make of Putin's response so far? Could the stretching of the front line open up opportunities elsewhere? The footage is too graphic to share here. Russian-covered trucks, estimated to be carrying a company-sized force of soldiers, sit on flat tires, still lined up in the neat, orderly row that they'd been traveling in just hours before. Damage to their vehicles immediately makes it obvious what fate befell them, pockmarked with small holes the size of large marbles. Sometime that morning, as the trucks hurried to bring a company-sized force of reinforcements to counter the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk, a distant HIMARS, high-mobility artillery rocket system operated by Ukrainian soldiers, went into action. It's not known how Ukraine managed to strike with such pinpoint precision miles inside Russian territory. There's growing evidence that Ukrainian hackers were able to break into the Russian traffic camera system, a massive network of cameras that allows for real-time monitoring of road and traffic conditions. This would give Ukraine eyes on every single highway and major roadway in the region, letting them precisely track the movements of Russian forces. Perhaps though it was a simple reconnaissance drone, of the type used in the thousands by both sides. Normally, flying such a drone so far inside Russia would be risky, as its high altitude would make it easier to spot for Russian air defenses, even if small drones remain notoriously difficult to target and track. But Russia would have had a very hard time coordinating any response to an airborne incursion, given the massive electronic warfare blitzkrieg that Ukraine unleashed as its tanks and armored vehicles smashed through the two lines of trenches staffed with conscripts that were all that stood between Russia and a Ukrainian invasion force. Communications were cut off or degraded to the point of uselessness, radars jammed. Many may have tried to warn the ill-fated convoy as it rolled straight into a Ukrainian ambush, but jamming would have made radio communications difficult, if not impossible. Given the disorganized nature of Russia's defense of Kursk, it's likely nobody knew what was waiting for the convoy. Seemingly zero precautions had been taken to secure the movement of troops against Ukrainian precision attacks. Moments after being detected, rockets loaded with hundreds of submunitions were screaming through the sky, bursting open a mile or so from their target and unleashing what Iraqi forces facing American weapons would call steel rain. Vehicles were instantly shredded, and dozens of troops sitting in the flatbeds never knew what hit them. Footage and photos from the strike show soldiers heaped on top of each other inside the trucks, falling over dead and onto each other on the floor of the truck as they were instantly killed. The photos and video would make its way around the internet within hours of being shot. Inside Russia, tight media controls would prevent them from being shown on television news reports or printed on newspapers, but many Russians have long ago adopted alternate means of keeping themselves informed. Platforms like Telegram, VK, WhatsApp, and even TikTok would host videos and photos of the carnage, reaching millions of Russian citizens. Most shocking of all, though, was the fact that this was not footage from the distant battlefields in Ukraine, and it wasn't contract Russian soldiers dead in their trucks. Many of these were conscripts, kids aged between 18 and 24, serving their mandatory year of military service, and they had died a terrible death just meters away from the front lawns of Russian homes. Things would quickly take a turn for the worse. News of the Ukrainian invasion of Russia's Kursk region broke slowly. Tight media controls hamper the flow of information, but the ineptitude of Russian military command, its federal agencies, and a healthy amount of disinformation efforts by Ukrainian intelligence all serve to significantly obfuscate the reality inside the besieged oblast. It would be the evacuation of thousands of refugees that would make the situation irrefutable and bring national attention to the true scale of the Ukrainian attack. Even then though, most military bloggers, a primary source of information for most Russians, downplayed the Ukrainian invasion or dismissed it entirely. After all, anti-Kremlin forces backed by Ukraine had launched raids into Russia before, and each time after snapping a few selfies, they fled back across the border before meeting significant resistance. By day 3 though, it was becoming increasingly clear that the situation in Kursk was much more serious than was originally believed. President Vladimir Putin had dropped the ball, or so it seemed, waiting 3 full days before announcing any plans to organize a resistance to what he deemed a terrorist incident in Kursk. This hints strongly that the Kremlin was completely blindsided and that it was struggling to come up with a realistic response plan to the invasion. Local officials, however, were fully aware of the scope of the disaster, as 75,000 residents fled the fighting in the first few days alone. During one televised meeting, an acting regional governor was chastised and silenced after stating that Ukrainian forces had seized 28 villages and made the situation, quote, very difficult. That public admission of seized Russian towns, however, would resonate across Russia, prompting a wave of fear and outrage across social media. It was difficult to get a clear picture of the situation in Kursk, prompting even more Russians to turn to mill bloggers on platforms such as Telegram. Many attempted to toe the Kremlin line and downplay the situation in Kursk, but others offered a much more sobering and honest account. Russian defenses had either been bypassed or completely collapsed. Troops are being cut off and surrounded. It was a repeat of Ukraine's famous Fall 2022 counterattack, only it was happening on Russian territory. And with growing horror, the Russian public began to realize the real cost of this war, because the casualty reports coming from the fighting were largely made up of conscripts. Russia has had a unique relationship between its people and its government regarding military conscripts. It was always accepted that Russian conscripts were treated poorly, with sexual, physical, and psychological abuse baked into the system, the rule of the grandfathers as it's known. Exploitation of conscripts by senior conscripts, regular soldiers, or their commanders was widespread and tolerated, even if they were used for slave labor in local farms or construction sites, with their superiors pocketing the profits of selling their labor. But after the disastrous invasion of Afghanistan, the Russian government set some unofficial conditions regarding its use of conscripts. The high casualties prompted Russian mothers to launch a national movement that threatened serious political turmoil, and the Kremlin would make a social contract with its citizens. If they allowed the government to do as it pleased, it wouldn't interfere much in their lives, and conscripts would not be used to fight outside of Russia. Thus, conscripts have been largely kept out of Russia's expeditionary fighting, though they were used in both Chechen wars and in a limited scope inside of Ukraine. The use of conscripts in Ukraine, however, set off a firestorm of controversy so intense that Vladimir Putin himself met with the mothers of killed conscripts months after the invasion of Ukraine, ensuring them that no more will be sent to the front lines. While there are still reports of conscripts inside Ukraine, it seems that the military has largely kept its promise and honored Russian law forbidding the use of conscripts in expeditionary roles. It's strange that conscript casualties will be so controversial in a society that regularly tolerates truly apocalyptic levels of normal casualties, and even the use of human wave meat grinder tactics. Yet these individuals are contract soldiers, people who chose to be there and accepted the risk, or they're prisoners, serving in the most dangerous positions for a chance at redemption. Russians accept these casualties even at levels that would prompt an immediate congressional investigation back home in the United States. But Russians are extremely sensitive to the deaths of conscripts, and that's bad news because as Ukraine forced its way into Kursk, this was largely all that stood in their way. Confusion quickly turned to outrage and grief as media released by Ukrainian forces made its way to the Russian blogosphere. While the public line from the Kremlin and state media was that the Ukrainian assault had been blunted, the truth coming from Ukrainian social media told a completely different story. Trenches of dead Russian soldiers, convoys ambushed by HIMARS and elite Ukrainian special forces, and video after video after video of the capture of huge numbers of POWs, as many as an entire company of soldiers in one single instance. Russian POWs, many of them conscripts, had their hands duct taped over their eyes to immobilize and blind them as they were transported back across the border to prison camps. Interviews with 18-year-old soldiers gave truth to the harrowing tale of their capture. Entire units decimated by far superior Ukrainian firepower, with the survivors quickly attempting to surrender. Once more, it was Russian mothers who were the first to organize, launching a social media movement to bring attention to the plight of conscripts. Within days of the invasion, at least 52 Russian families were inquiring with the Ministry of Defense on the status of their sons stationed in Kursk. A Change.org petition was created, imploring President Vladimir Putin to withdraw conscripts from combat operations, citing inexperience and a lack of weapons. Launched on August 7th, the petition had just over 9,000 signatures on August 15th. A full-scale offensive is currently taking place in our territory. Please save the lives of untrained soldiers in combat, read the petition. Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin was silent on the matter. In the subsequent days, even more casualties and POWs would follow. Russia had relied heavily on the use of conscripts on its border, believing that Ukraine would never dare invade Russia thanks to Putin's heavy use of nuclear threats to intimidate the West. These forces had little to no training and very poor equipment. According to one captured conscript, he went to the shooting range only one time and fired 2 rounds. That would be the culmination of his military training before being sent to Kursk to guard the border. Member of the State Duma Andrei Gurylev would try to assuage Russian fears, stating shortly after the invasion that, quote, "In this conflict, conscripts in the Kursk region successfully defended an entire brigade's assault, and not a single soldier was lost." The truth was significantly different from his public statement, and Russia was finding loopholes around its social contract with the Russian people to not send conscripts into combat. Per a Russian source, as conscript forces were being evacuated from the fighting, they were allegedly forced to sign military contracts and sent back into the fighting. The difficulty for Russian forces is the deep integration of conscripts with regular army forces, with units having a mix of contract soldiers and conscripts. This makes it impossible to simply separate the two as they're being prepared to counterattack Ukrainian forces. With the invasion so fresh though, it's unknown what effect this will have on the Russian people, especially as Ukraine continues to gain ground and Russia seems to be scrambling for solutions. A force made up of private military companies, FSB border security forces, regular army forces, interior ministry forces, and irregular forces like Chechen soldiers is being assembled to attempt to stem the Ukrainian invasion. But none of these forces share a joint command structure, and Russia has proven it's extremely inept at establishing clear chains of command and conducting joint operations. Inevitably, this means more casualties on Russian soil, with many of them being conscripts. There has been a sense of outrage as well within Russian society over the Ukrainian attack. Yet while normally one would expect a rally around the flag effect, surging volunteers into the military and popular support for the war, this does not seem to be the case in Russia. Putin has recently announced another round of cash incentives for volunteers, and the Defense Ministry has put out calls for personnel willing to dig trenches and set up defensive fortifications in Kursk with a high pay incentive. The use of high pay packets strongly indicates that despite Russian territory being invaded, the expected surge of patriotic volunteers to join the army has not happened, though the situation is still early and things may change. Indications are, though, that a growing fear has gripped Russian society, as it becomes abundantly clear from how the Kremlin is fumbling its response to the invasion that a new round of mobilization may be inevitable. While gaining ground in the east, Russia has officially lost more of its own territory in 1 week than it took from Ukraine all year long. Much of a massive American aid package signed into law in late spring is yet to arrive in Ukraine, and Western support continues to ramp up, with huge new aid packages announced in the wake of Ukraine's success in Kursk. If Russia is unable to defend its own territory and push out a Ukrainian assault with the forces it has, the public has little illusion about what might come next. Putin, however, clearly fears a fresh mobilization, given how deeply unpopular the last partial mobilization was. The question is, how will the Kursk invasion factor into the public's tolerance of another round of mobilization? And how will they tolerate a 3-day special military operation to take Kyiv that has resulted in the first invasion of Russian territory since World War II?
Ever since Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his special military operation against Ukraine in February 2022, the war has been marked by a brutal stalemate. Russia floods Ukraine with soldiers and equipment, while Ukraine valiantly defends its territory, occasionally launching counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. For nearly 30 months, this grinding conflict has followed a predictable pattern, largely because Ukraine was restricted from using Western-supplied weapons against targets inside Russia, a move that could have escalated tensions in Europe to a dangerous level. That's all changed. In a dramatic shift, US President Joe Biden, backed by other NATO allies like the UK, has given Ukraine the green light to strike back directly on Russian soil. This bold decision shatters the so-called red line that had held Ukraine back, and it's setting the stage for a turning point in the war. Ukrainian forces have crossed into Russia, targeting the strategic region of Kursk. This marks the first time since the war began that Ukrainian troops have moved beyond their own borders. So what does this mean for Putin? Why Kursk? And most crucially, what could this development mean for the future of the Ukraine war? Let's dive into these questions, starting with the most pressing one. What on earth is happening in Kursk? On August 6, 2024, Ukraine broke through the thin Russian line of defenses separating Ukraine from Kursk, allowing its soldiers to enter Russian territory for the first time. This breakthrough went underreported on the day that it happened, possibly because media outlets were taking a wait-and-see approach under the assumption that Russia would quickly push the Ukrainian forces back. That isn't what happened. A day later, The Guardian was among the first to properly report on the incursion, noting that the fighting in Kursk had entered its second day, with reports suggesting that Ukraine's forces had managed to advance up to 9 miles away from the border and deeper into the Kursk Oblast. That incursion had been made possible by a highway running north of Sverdlikovo, a Russian border village that also happens to be close to a key natural gas transmission hub. While those reports were unconfirmed at the time, The Guardian pointed out that both official and unofficial Russian sources were claiming that the incursion had happened and that it appeared to involve several hundred Ukrainian soldiers who had taken advantage of the fact that the border between their country and Kursk is one of the most lightly guarded, from the Russian perspective, on the entire front line. Russia was quick to claim that it had already neutralized the incursion. Its defense ministry claimed the incursion was neutralized on the day that it happened, only to backpedal by the time The Guardian released its report to claim that it was ongoing as of lunchtime on August 7th. Russia also provided details on what it had done to counter the offensive. It says using missile strikes and artillery, it destroyed 50 armored vehicles and inflicted 260 casualties on the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine remained tight-lipped about the entire operation. On August 8th, several other media outlets picked up on the story. These included Le Monde, a French news website, which claimed that Ukraine had actually sent 1,000 troops into Kursk, rather than the previously reported several hundred. It also reported more details on what Ukraine did once it crossed the Russian border. Backed by more than 2,000 soldiers that stayed on the Ukrainian side, defending their position and perhaps preparing to follow the initial 1,000 into Kursk, Ukraine crossed the border with 10 tanks and 20 armored vehicles. That immediately casts aspersions on Russia's claims to have destroyed 50 armored vehicles, showcasing just how difficult it is to ascertain full details of what's happened so far. Once Ukraine crossed the border, Russia declared a state of emergency in Kursk as soldiers advanced on several localities, including a small town named Sudza. These localities were bombarded with Ukrainian missiles and drones, reportedly causing at least 5 deaths and over 30 injuries. Furthermore, the August 6th incursion had resulted in fighting breaking out in Oleshnya and Goncharivka, both in the Kursk Oblast, with Russian soldiers in the latter region supposedly being surrounded and captured by Ukrainian forces. The next day saw Ukraine advance further, according to Le Monde, resulting in the capture of around 20 poorly defended Russian villages, including Gornal, Daryuno, and the previously mentioned Sverdlikovo. Those captures also led to Ukraine taking control of the Sudza gas station, a gas transfer point overseen by Russian energy giant Gazprom that represents one of the few entry points for Russian gas into the Ukrainian gas transmission system. This station matters because it's key to Russia being able to transport gas into Europe, meaning the taking of the station will put a small dent into Russia's profitable energy market. NPR also published a report on August 8th detailing the incursion. It backed Le Monde's claims of 1,000 Ukrainians entering Kursk, noting that the number comes from General Valery Gerasimov, who is Russia's chief of general staff. It also noted that it was the first such offensive carried out by Ukraine. Though it had previously backed small groups of Russian exiles as they carried out limited cross-border raids, the incursion into Kursk was the first time that Ukrainian soldiers had entered Russia since the war began. Putin was left with egg on his face. After spending so much of the war trying to portray Russia as an indomitable power to which Ukraine would crumble over time, he now finds himself having to explain why he's allowed Ukraine to take Russian territory. To rub salt into his wounds, the incursion is far from over. At the time of writing, Al Jazeera is running a live tracker covering the Ukraine war, which says the Ukrainian soldiers are still fighting Russians in Kursk. That tracker also contains a quote from Mikhailo Podolyak, a Ukrainian presidential aide, who pins the blame for the incursion on Russia. The root cause of any escalation, shelling, military actions, forced evacuations, and destruction of normal life forms, including within the Russian Federation's own territories like Kursk and the Belgorod regions, is solely Russia's unequivocal aggression, he wrote in a social media post. Al Jazeera also offers a different number for the tanks that have crossed the border, 24 instead of 10. So the details are still blurry.
What we can say for sure is that Ukraine is in Kursk and that it's taken up to 1,000 soldiers over the border into Russia. Those soldiers are accompanied by tanks and armored vehicles, in addition to seemingly having access to missiles and drones. They've used these weapons well. Up to 20 small Russian villages are apparently under Ukraine's control, however temporarily that control might last, along with a key Russian gas station. All of this brings us to another key question. Why did Ukraine choose Kursk? That's a question that the White House has been asking. On the evening of August 7th, the US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, published an update on the incursion. It confirmed that US intelligence indicates that Ukraine has penetrated at least 2 of Russia's defensive lines on its sojourn into Kursk, as well as taking a stronghold. It also cited both satellite imagery and geolocation footage to apparently confirm the reports that Ukraine has taken dozens of captives and that it now controls the Sudza gas distribution station. These early reports have prompted the White House to contact Ukraine's leadership to quiz them on the objectives of the incursion. Speaking on August 7th, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, noted, "We're going to reach out to the Ukrainian military to learn more about their objectives." She also pointed out that the White House supports what she calls common sense actions to stop Russia's attacks. Perhaps the use of the term common sense is a subtle indicator of what the US thinks about the incursion. After all, there appears to be little immediate military value to taking the territory within the Kursk Oblast outside of taking the previously mentioned gas distribution station. And even then, the value is minor. That station sends gas into Ukraine and has likely seen minimal use since the war started. Digging deeper into Kursk itself further demonstrates how it appears to hold minimal strategic value. Though the oblast covers 11,582 square miles, it only contains 1.061 million people, meaning it's far from one of Russia's major population centers. You could argue that its hilly surface and multiple ravines could provide some tactical advantage to Ukraine, assuming it wishes to use Kursk as the launching point for further incursions into Russia, but that seems unlikely. A force of 1,000 isn't what a country sends when it intends to take over an entire oblast. Kursk is a center for agriculture, with farms covering around 77% of its territory and mostly growing sugar beets and wheat, with some fodder crops thrown in for good measure. But again, that's nowhere near enough value to justify an incursion through which Ukraine intends to permanently hold the territory it's captured. Which brings us back to the question, what is Ukraine's goal as it moves deeper into Kursk? The answers don't necessarily have to do with Kursk itself, with the oblast simply being the most convenient available to allow Ukraine to achieve its objectives. Rather, as the BBC explains, the goal may be an entirely different piece of territory, Donetsk. Donetsk, which is part of the wider Donbass region, has been a key target for Russia ever since Putin's special military operation started, and symbolically the Donetsk region is somewhat tied to Russia. A large portion of its people are ethnically Russian and speak Russian as their primary language. Granted, those ethnic Russians don't make up the majority of Donetsk's population, unlike what we saw in Crimea in 2014 and beyond, but there's certainly a Russian influence in the region. After all, as DW points out, it was in Donetsk and the surrounding regions that opposition to Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution and the Maidan protests of 2013 and 14 were strongest. The Donbass itself has been no stranger to war even before Putin invaded Ukraine. 2014 saw pro-Russian separatists proclaim both Donetsk and Luhansk as people's republics independent of Ukraine, likely with the goal of integrating them into Russia. The point here is that Donetsk offers symbolic importance to Russia. With that symbolic importance comes a continued push to take the region since the beginning of the war. That's why Russia has committed so many soldiers to Donetsk. Tens of thousands of Russian troops have been poured into the region, with Russia also focusing on developing a nearly impenetrable front line through which it pushes against increasingly weakening Ukrainian resistance. Glide bombs pepper Donetsk daily, with the taking of Donetsk setting the stage for Russia's later successes in overtaking the fortress towns of Avdiivka and Bakhmut. In short, Russia is dedicating a ton of its resources to Donbass and Donetsk in particular, which makes what's happening in Donetsk all the more interesting since Ukraine entered Kursk. Speaking to the BBC, a military analyst named Mikhailo Zrokov points out that Russia has been forced to redeploy some of the soldiers it had stationed in Donetsk following the Kursk invasion. If you look at the official reports, he claims, there were significantly fewer Russian glide bombs dropped in the Donetsk area. That means the aircraft which carry them are now elsewhere in Russia. Elsewhere is likely Kursk. Ukraine's Kursk incursion has been a success in terms of pulling Russian forces away from a region in which they were previously focused. That may have been the goal all along. Throughout the course of the Ukraine war, Russia has succeeded in focusing the brunt of the fighting in areas in which it wants to take. That's logical, as the invading force, Russia essentially forces Ukraine to react by sending troops to whichever areas on which it focuses. This natural ebb and flow of the war has resulted in Russia leaving scant defenses across some areas of the front line it shares with Ukraine. The northeastern borders, which Ukraine crossed to enter Kursk, were some of the most minimally defended of all. So what we're likely seeing with the Kursk incursion is Ukraine forcing Russia to divert troops away from regions that Russia considers a priority. In creating those diversions, Ukraine weakens the Russian front lines in Donetsk, perhaps opening the door for counterattacks against Russia's offensives. If nothing else, the diversions offer a reprieve to Ukrainian soldiers near Donetsk, who are being bombarded by Russia's glide bombs, giving them time to regroup and reorganize their defenses. Ukraine is essentially keeping Russia honest. It's forcing Putin to realize that he can't be complacent when it comes to taking on Ukraine. Any weakness he displays, such as not reinforcing the front lines near Kursk, can be exploited by Ukraine and used against him. That brings us to a secondary reason why Ukraine may have moved into Kursk. Ukraine is showing that it, along with many of its supporters, is unafraid of crossing a red line. We touched on this earlier when we talked about how several Western nations are allowing Ukraine to use their weapons to attack Russia in its own territory. Perhaps the Kursk incursion is an extension of that. Ukraine will not only fire missiles behind the front lines, but it will actively take Russian territory to show Putin that it's just as capable of invading and fighting within Russia as Russia is of invading Ukraine. Interestingly, Ukraine may even have a modicum of support from the US with this incursion. Though the US is still seeking answers from Ukraine, as we mentioned earlier, the White House also pointed out that the restrictions the US has in place for the use of its weapons in Russia's territory haven't changed. Tellingly, White House spokesman John Kirby went on to say that the Kursk incursion was not a violation of our policy. So the US is looking for common-sense answers, but Ukraine's actions are very unlikely to cause any tensions between it and its most powerful Western ally. So we have two potential reasons for the Kursk incursion so far. Ukraine has used it to stretch Russia's forces along the front lines, potentially relieving pressure in Donetsk. And also it may be using the incursion to showcase just how far it and its Western allies are now willing to step over the red lines that previously prevented Ukraine from doing anything but defend itself against Putin's special military operation. But there's another reason why Ukraine may have chosen now to take territory in Kursk: negotiations. In May 2024, reports started surfacing about Putin being ready to end the Ukraine war through a negotiated ceasefire that would recognize the front lines at the time. From that ceasefire, Russia would enter deeper negotiations that would likely see it try to claim the Ukrainian territory it controlled at the time. That would have seen it essentially take much of the Donbass, including Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as southern regions such as Mariupol. In other words, Russia had a powerful negotiating position. No matter how faltering its invasion of Ukraine may have been, it had still successfully taken territory and was now ready to end the war, claiming that territory permanently. Reuters noted that several sources inside the Kremlin believe Putin was ready to push for these negotiations. One of the 5 it spoke to claimed, "Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire, to freeze the war." Putin himself had practically said as much during a May press conference he held in Belarus, in which he said, "Let them resume," when talking about the possibility of negotiations opening. However, that resumption could only happen if the negotiations were based on the realities on the ground. Ukraine would have to cede territory for Russia to stop, and worst of all, Ukraine had no leverage that it could bring to the negotiating table. With the taking of around 20 villages and a key gas distribution system in Kursk, Ukraine now has leverage. It's possible that Ukraine has taken this territory intending to hold it for the long term. If that's the case, we'll see more troops funneling into Kursk in the coming days. Remember that Ukraine sent an extra 2,000 to support the 1,000 who entered, and more territory taken. Should Russia and Ukraine enter negotiations while Ukraine still controls this territory, it finally has some leverage to bring to ceasefire talk. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky could tell Putin that he would be willing to trade the territory in Kursk for some of the Ukrainian territory Russia has taken. Whether that approach would work, or if Russia would be willing to enter negotiations when Ukraine controls some of its territory, remains to be seen. Which brings us to the final big question we'll ask in this video: what comes next? Russia's response, for one thing. In the immediate aftermath of the Kursk invasion, the oblast's regional governor, Alexei Smirnov, declared a state of emergency. He claimed the move was necessary to eliminate the consequences of enemy forces coming into the region. Air alerts were issued over Kursk, with Russia scrambling fighter jets, which the BBC says were filmed flying low to the ground over the region on the hunt for Ukrainian soldiers. This footage lends credence to Mikhailo Zhrokov's claims that Russia was diverting fighter jets from the Donetsk region to handle its Kursk crisis. Meanwhile, Ukrainian politicians have found themselves just as curious about the reasons behind the incursion as everybody else. Speaking on Facebook, Alexei Honcharenko, a member of Ukraine's parliament, claimed the attacks has led to the taking of territory before adding that he didn't know what the plan was. However, he claimed it would show Europeans and Americans that Russia can and needs to be attacked. Again, the message here is to support Ukraine in crossing even more red lines. After all, this is the first time since World War II that any Russian territory has been occupied by an opposing force. And as Honcharенko points out, Putin did not turn to nukes and so on, meaning Ukraine is showing the world that the world should not be scared of escalation or the reaction of Putin. Another humiliation for Putin. Despite all of the threats he's made during the war, which have included threats of deploying tactical nuclear weapons, red line after red line has now been crossed. Now he has Ukrainian troops in his territory and he hasn't followed through on any of his threats. Is that because he's smart enough to know that going nuclear would lead to World War III? Or is he not following through on his threats because he knows that Russia couldn't handle a war with NATO and the US after having depleted itself so thoroughly in Ukraine? Back in Russia, Andrei Belyusov, who became Russia's defense minister in May 2024 after previously serving as the country's first deputy prime minister for 4 years, faces his first major test. Part of passing that test appears to be taking part in the Kremlin's efforts to turn the incursion into pro-Russian propaganda. Putin is spearheading this campaign, claiming on the second day of the incursion that Ukraine's actions were not only a major provocation, but that its soldiers were firing indiscriminately at civilians, their homes, and Kursk's public buildings. Those claims aren't yet confirmed. Militaristically, Russia has clearly sent forces into Kursk to push back the Ukrainian advance, though it's unclear how successful they've been. Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of general staff, claims that Russia is continuing to destroy the adversary in areas directly adjacent to the Russian-Ukrainian border. That's a statement vague enough to suggest that Ukraine is still in Kursk and Russia hasn't been able to repel the 1,000 soldiers in the territory just yet. Even worse for the Kremlin is that these public claims of pushing back Ukraine are being disputed on Telegram, which is Russia's most popular social media channel. Several pro-war channels on the network claim the situation is far worse for Russia than the politicians are claiming. One such channel, Rybar, says that the situation is continuing to deteriorate, while noting that Ukrainian formations were advancing towards towns. Again, those claims aren't confirmed either. It all adds up to a confused state of affairs, in which we know Ukrainian soldiers are in Kursk, but we're still uncertain exactly how successful or otherwise they are following the initial taking of villages and a gas distribution station. Add claims of captured Russian soldiers into the mix and you get even more confusion. An August 9th report in the Kyiv Independent claims that drone footage published by Ukraine shows 32 captured Russian soldiers, adding that the Telegram post that showcased the footage claimed that a further 8 were out of frame. More claims were being made, but they offered yet another example of claims that can't be verified independently. What is clear is that the Kursk incursion shows a change in Ukrainian tactics. For over 2 years, it has bedded into its own territory, fortifying to enable it to defend against slow Russian advances. That approach has proved lethal for Russia. It's lost 588,540 soldiers since the start of the war, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. But now, whittling away at the seemingly never-ending stream of soldiers Putin is sending into Ukraine isn't enough for Zelensky. The incursion into Kursk shows that Ukraine is willing to go on the attack, which will send shockwaves throughout Russia as Putin realizes that his country is no longer safe behind the front lines of the Ukraine war. That change in approach could lead to consequences for Ukraine in the long run. That could especially be the case in Africa, where the BBC claims Ukraine has been trying to win allies during the war with Russia. Over the last 3 days, Mali and Niger have both cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine, ostensibly over comments by a Ukrainian military official who suggested that Ukraine may have played a role in the killing of several dozen Malian soldiers in July 2024. Those soldiers were working alongside mercenaries from the infamous Wagner Group and were apparently killed in clashes with Al-Qaeda-linked militants. Andriy Yusov claimed in the immediate aftermath that the separatist rebels the Malian soldiers fought received the necessary information they needed to carry out their attacks. An unsubstantiated comment, but one that has triggered Mali, Niger, and Senegal to cut ties with Ukraine, all coincidentally right as Ukrainian troops entered Kursk. It's possible that the Kremlin put pressure on all three to do so, with Ukraine calling Mali's decision short-sighted and hasty, while claiming that it complies with all aspects of international law. Perhaps Ukraine wasn't involved in the killing of Malian troops at all. Instead, we may be seeing Russian influence-based politics at play again, as it labels Ukraine as the aggressor while using the Kursk incursion to prove its point. Ukraine loses 3 potential African allies, or at least 3 countries with which it could deepen diplomatic ties, and Russia forces a small propaganda victory. That's all conjecture, but it shows that Ukraine's differing approach to handling Russia could have ramifications on a wider scale. What isn't conjecture is that Ukraine's latest actions aren't part of the Russian plan. None of this is. The special military operation in Ukraine was supposed to be short, sharp, and devastating. Now Russia is bogged down in a protracted war that has not only cost it hundreds of thousands of soldiers and huge amounts of military equipment, but is now seeing it lose territory to a country that it's trying to conquer. The plan is failing. And with that, we'll ask you what you think about Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. Is this the start of a new approach that will see Ukraine taking even more Russian territory in the future? Or is it a short-term crossing of a red line designed to stretch Russia's troops? How do you think Putin will respond to the humiliation he's experienced as a result of this incursion?
It's August 6, 2024. The date marks the first time that Ukraine's pilots have started flying F-16s, an event that many see as a potential turning point for the Ukraine war. Granted, the limited number of F-16s provided to Ukraine by its Western allies won't allow it to establish full aerial superiority over Russia. But now it has options. Localized superiority is possible, as are aerial attacks on Russian encampments and even Russian territory. It's a big moment for Ukraine. But soon the arrival of F-16s is going to be overshadowed by Ukraine making a move that nobody expected. Ukraine is about to invade Russia. Specifically, its forces are going to break the front lines to the north of the country and pour into Kursk, a Russian oblast that is sparsely populated and even more sparsely defended. Russia hasn't placed much importance on the region, instead preferring to focus most of its invasion efforts in Donetsk as it continues a slow push toward Kyiv. But the night of August 6, 2024 changes everything. Ukraine officially holds Russian territory. In this video, we're going to explain why Ukraine's invasion of Russia has changed the entire complexion of the war, to the point that Putin may never fully recover, and explain why it's such a crucial event. But before we do, we'll start with a quick recap. On August 7th, reports started circulating that Russia had supposedly repelled a group of 300 Ukrainian fighters, supported by tanks, that broke through the front lines in the north of Ukraine and entered Kursk. Russian officials claimed the Ukrainian offensive resulted in 5 deaths and 20 injuries, but the implication was that it had been successfully fought off. The implication was wrong. As more details emerged about Ukraine's unexpected foray into Russian territory, it was quickly revealed that this was no small attack. For Russia, the situation was far from controllable, despite the words of Kursk regional head Alexei Smirnov. Instead, Ukraine hadn't just gotten into Russian territory, it was advancing at a rapid pace. Intense fighting marked August 8th, with more details rapidly emerging. The French news outlet Le Monde revealed that Ukraine's incursion involved as many as 1,000 soldiers, with a further 2,000 backing that initial group up from behind the Ukrainian border, and that the invasion was of a far larger scale than Russia claimed. It has also been remarkably successful. Ukraine had pushed 9 miles into Kursk, taking 20 villages along the way. Among those villages was the small town of Sudza, which is home to a gas transmission station that Russia used to send natural gas to the rest of Europe. Far from controlling the situation, as Smirnov claimed he would, the Kursk regional leader instead declared a state of emergency. Thousands of Russians have been evacuated from their homes so far, indicating that Russia has failed to prevent the Ukrainian advance, despite all of its claims to the contrary. The advance has continued to August 13th, the date of the scripting of this video. Between August 8th and now, Ukraine has launched multiple drone and artillery strikes against locations in Kursk. It's also advanced even further into Russian territory. August 9th saw the Institute for the Study of War claim that Ukraine had pushed on from the initial 9 miles it had captured, with its soldiers advancing as far as Kromskaya Baiki, which is over 21 miles into Russian territory. That day also saw Ukraine officially confirm the invasion, with the country having remained tight-lipped during the initial 3 days of fighting. More attacks followed in the coming days. Russia claimed that the UK was helping Ukraine with its invasion, with State Duma member Adalbi Shagashev saying that English had been heard among the soldiers. That isn't confirmed, and it's just an indicator of just how much chaos Ukraine's forces are spreading throughout Kursk. The strategy was also unfurling. Ukraine was sending small groups of soldiers into villages, bypassing Russian fortifications in the process before fighting and withdrawing to attack elsewhere. Those small groups were being followed by larger ones, which consolidated and kept the territory the smaller groups attacked, as Russia's forces found themselves further spread out and confused. This was no quick raid. Ukraine was actively capturing and keeping territory in Russia. Russia responded by sending more forces to the Kursk region, diverting soldiers who had previously been on the front lines in Donetsk in an effort to tackle the emerging problem. Those diversions haven't stopped Ukraine. Over the last few days, it's expanded its incursions to include the Belgorod region, another Russian oblast close to the Ukraine border, which is now seeing small groups of Ukrainian troops launching attacks and taking territory. Today, there may be as many as 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers occupying territory inside Russia. Over 76,000 civilians have been evacuated, with many en route to Moscow, and Ukraine is claiming that it continues to take territory.
On August 12th, Commander Alexander Syrski, who was one of Ukraine's leading military minds, claimed that Ukraine controlled 28 villages and a staggering 386 square miles of Russian territory. Ukraine had taken a massive gamble with this invasion. Faced both with encroaching Russian forces in Donetsk and the possibility of international blowback over it finally taking the role of aggressor in its fight against Russia, it rolled the dice. It gambled that it would not only be able to get away with fighting in Kursk, but that it would also successfully capture Russian territory without Putin resorting to nuclear weapons. It also gambled its relationship with its Western partners. Crossing the final red line had the potential to anger some of the countries that have provided weapons and financial support to Ukraine. The gamble paid off. Ukraine officially holds Russian territory. And even more worrying for Putin, he's had to watch as his forces have crumbled and the responses that he's attempted to muster have not only failed to dispel Ukraine's forces, those responses have also failed to stop Ukraine from pushing even further. The Kursk invasion has changed everything. Putin has suffered the biggest humiliation he's ever experienced as Russian leader, and it's a humiliation from which he may never recover. Why? It all starts with exposure. Ukraine's actions in Kursk have exposed Russia's military as being far weaker than anybody anticipated. Of course, you could argue that the entire war has been a cavalcade of this type of exposure for Russia. When Putin first launched his special military operation in February 2022, much of the world assumed that it would be over quickly. After all, Russia had a far larger, and on paper, much stronger military. Even today, Russia has 1.32 million active military personnel compared to Ukraine's 900,000. With rounds of conscription leading to more being called up as needed, Russia has more than 10 times the number of aircraft, as well as 13,000 more tanks and more than 139,000 more armored vehicles. It should have steamrolled through Ukraine, even with the military support Ukraine is receiving from Western nations. Instead, we've seen a protracted war in which Russia has failed to establish any sort of aerial dominance. As the Journal of the JAPCC points out, Russia quickly started losing not only its outdated Su-25s, but also its far more modern Su-30s, Su-34s, and Su-35s when fighting Ukraine. The losses were so bad that Russia resorted to launching aerial attacks from behind the front lines. It uses glide bombs, old Soviet-era bombs fitted with a modern wing mechanism, to assault Ukrainian fortifications rather than risking its helicopters and fighters. That shouldn't have happened. With its aerial might, Russia should have been able to support its troops on the ground with precision strikes from its fighter jets, but it's failed to do so. Russia has also lost about a third of the Black Sea Fleet to Ukrainian missile and drone strikes, meaning the small naval component of the war that should have been in Russia's favor has become largely irrelevant. On the ground, Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claims that Russia has lost around 594,400 soldiers, along with nearly 8,500 tanks, over 16,000 armored fighting vehicles, and around 16,800 artillery units. Then there's the increasing reliance on Soviet-era equipment. Reports suggest that Russia has resorted to using old T-55 tanks, which are 65 years old and far from capable of serving in direct assaults against Ukrainian positions due to their thin steel armor being easily penetrable by even basic rocket-launched grenades. That's without mentioning the more modern drones and weapons Ukraine has been using to take out Russian tanks. In short, the entire war has offered humiliation after humiliation for Putin, with his increasingly aging stocks of equipment failing to achieve the victory the world assumed would have happened long before now. Fast forward to today, and the Kursk invasion further exposes Russia's weakness. It shows that Russia has failed to properly fortify the entire front line, which stretches around 620 miles. To the north, in particular, Russia didn't dedicate enough manpower or equipment to guarding the front line, allowing a small contingent of Ukrainian soldiers to break through and enter Kursk. It was too focused on Donetsk and too complacent elsewhere. Now it faces attacks on its own territory that would have been unimaginable when the war began. It gets worse for Putin. Not only does Russia face attacks in its own territory, but it's failing to fend them off. Ukraine is advancing through Kursk, as well as encroaching into Belgorod. Russia is actively losing villages and townships, showing that its faltering attacking might is matched by a lack of proper defenses behind the front lines. From there, add the lack of Western response to these attacks. None of Ukraine's allies have come out to oppose the strikes, with the biggest response being a request from the White House for Ukraine to provide details about its objectives for the Kursk region. That's more bad news for Putin. It shows that the West believes he's too weak to do anything about Ukraine invading Russian territory. Now Putin's threats, which he has repeatedly failed to follow up on, seem even weaker than they did before, as the Russian leader instead faces the humiliation of allowing a war he started to come to his doorstep. All of this brings us to the second reason why the Kursk invasion represents a pivotal moment for Putin as Russia's leader. It represents the crossing of the final red line in the Ukraine war. These red lines are the actions that have been taken throughout the war that the West believed would provoke Putin into further action. Providing military aid to Ukraine was considered a red line at the war's beginning, leading to several countries choosing to only offer non-lethal equipment. That red line has since been thoroughly crossed. Ukraine has now received over $121 billion in aid from Europe, along with about $82 billion from the US, with more incoming. Other supposed red lines included the installation of NATO infrastructure in Finland and Sweden, which is now extremely likely given that both have become NATO members since the war in Ukraine began, and Western countries allowed Ukraine to use the weapons they provide in Russian territory. All of those lines have been crossed. Putin has done nothing about them. With Ukraine's advancement into Kursk, the final red line in the Ukraine war has disappeared, and Putin quickly revealed that he will once again do nothing in response. At least he'll do nothing to the West. For all of his bluster about what such an incursion could mean in the context of a global war, Putin has barely been able to summon defenses against a few thousand Ukrainians within his border. Ukraine continues to advance as Putin looks weaker than ever. The invasion is a humiliation. It's something that not only should have never happened from a militaristic point of view, as Russia was supposed to be so strong that Ukraine would never break through the front lines, but it's also an invasion that represents humiliation for Putin geopolitically. His lack of follow-through on his threats throughout the war has shown the West that Russia's leader likely believes that his military isn't capable of taking on the rest of Europe. And psychologically, as the Atlantic Council points out, this crossing of the final red line also strikes a powerful blow against enemy morale. Russia, having already seen its military fail to defeat Ukraine quickly, now has to contend with mass evacuations and the panic that comes with having an invading force in its own territory. Putin's failures have forced his people to experience a taste of the medicine he's trying to deliver to Ukraine. The result is a growing lack of appetite for the Ukraine war in Russia itself. This was revealed by Euronews in December 2023 when it reported on a poll conducted by the independent company Chronicle. That poll discovered that support for the Ukraine war in Russia had nearly halved since a similar poll conducted in February 2023. Speaking to 1,199 adults across Russia between October 17th and 22nd, the Chronicle found that those who expressed consistent support for the war dropped to 12% from the previous result of 22%. What's more, 40% of those surveyed supported Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine, even if Russia's war objectives weren't achieved. The poll also revealed that 33% of Russians were against exiting Ukraine now that Russia is there, but even that number fell substantially from the 47% seen in February 2023. These dismal numbers, from Putin's perspective, were recorded before Ukraine invaded Kursk. With the final red line disappearing into the distance, it's only logical to assume that even more Russians will now want the war to end because they're scared that their homes could be next on the Ukrainian agenda. And as if to add all of these problems for Putin, America's response to Ukraine's actions has been flippant at best. Beyond the previously mentioned inquiries from the White House, August 13th saw President Joe Biden tell reporters in New Orleans that the invasion is creating a real dilemma for Putin. While the US has been quick to deny any involvement in the operation, "We had nothing to do with this," said White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre. This is far from the response Putin would have wanted. The US should have been on Ukraine's back from the moment it crossed into Russian territory. It was meant to warn Ukraine that this was an escalation that couldn't be tolerated, while telling them they needed to get out and only fight to defend Ukrainian territory. None of that happened. So Putin is left with a situation where the West isn't trying to stop Ukraine from invading, which tells him and the Russian people that the West isn't afraid of Russia anymore. The tentative approach taken at the beginning of the Ukraine war has evaporated. The red lines are all crossed. Putin has done very little in response other than continue his special military operation, and the Russian president's humiliation runs deeper. He's even had to deal with his own people losing their appetite for the war, even long before it arrived in their country. Russian morale is low. Putin's position as a strongman in Russian politics is now on shaky ground. And even worse for Russia's leader is that there are even more issues that the Kursk invasion has caused. Issues like Ukraine forcing Russia to change its strategy. As the National Interest pointed out in an article on August 10th covering Ukraine's high-stakes gamble, the incursion into Kursk may have been as much a strategic play as it was a move designed to expose Russia's weaknesses. On August 1st, Al Jazeera reported that the last week of July 2024 saw Russia launch the largest assault in 8 months within the Donetsk region of Ukraine. That assault was successful, as it led to Russia claiming several Ukrainian settlements and brought Russia closer to cutting off key supply lines that are helping Ukraine's troops fight against it in Donetsk. With those supply routes cut off, Ukraine would be forced to withdraw from the region en masse. Donetsk has been a key Russian focus for much of 2023 and into 2024. Earlier in the year, it managed to take Avdiivka, which many saw as a key Ukrainian fortification. That followed the taking of Bakhmut in May 2023, a similar fortified location that was key to Ukraine's defenses. Through these advances, it's clear that Russia is attempting to slowly take territory in Ukraine's east and south. By taking these fortified towns, Russia can press its advantage because it now has multiple launching points for offensives in southeastern Ukraine. August 4th brought with it more bad news for Ukraine in Donetsk. The country was forced to order the mandatory evacuation of children, along with their guardians, from Donetsk's eastern region in the face of Russian advances. More villages were falling, and more locations were being bombed. Ukraine has been standing on the edge of losing one of its territories for months now. Russia has even claimed that it successfully annexed Donetsk back in 2022, even though it still doesn't have full control of the territory. Why does any of this matter in the context of the Kursk invasion? Russia's advancement through Donetsk had forced Ukraine into a position where it couldn't make any significant breakthroughs in the south or east. Russia's forces are simply too strong in those regions, with Russia also sending a seemingly never-ending supply of manpower to the region to fortify the positions it takes. Enter the Kursk invasion. By committing so many people to Donetsk, Putin failed to properly supply the troops occupying the northern front lines. That paved the way for Ukraine's forces to break through and into Russia. Now that Ukraine is in Kursk and taking territory itself, Russia will be forced to divert forces away from Donetsk to defend itself. Forces and equipment will have to go north to fight back against the invading forces in Kursk, with much of those resources coming from Donetsk. Thus, Ukraine gains new opportunities. It weakens the fronts in the south and east of its territory, opening up the possibility of counterattacks that could allow it to reclaim some of the territory Russia has taken in Donetsk. It also forces Putin into a strategic rethink. For the entire war, Putin has operated under the assumption that Ukraine posed no threat to Russia. He could afford to dedicate more troops to one region than another because all the fighting would take place in Ukraine. So what if the front lines to the north were poorly equipped? Even if Ukraine pushed them back, it would never break through and actually enter Russia. Except it would. And it has. The Kursk invasion has changed the entire complexion of the war in that regard. Now Putin has to account for the possibility that Ukraine will enter other areas of Russia, meaning he can't afford to allow any sort of weakness across the front line. On a practical level, that means Russia is going to need more soldiers and more equipment, the latter already being an issue, given that the country is relying on Soviet-era equipment and is rapidly seeing its stockpiles dwindle. The alternative is that Russia will have to spread its troops further across the front lines of the war. While that will strengthen some areas, it'll also mean pulling soldiers away from regions that Russia wants to take. The result is likely going to be a net loss, as Russia is less effective in the areas in which it wants to advance because it's being forced to guard itself against Ukrainian incursions elsewhere. For the first time since the war began, the issue of where the fighting takes place is no longer in Putin's control. Ukraine had taken the initiative and shifted the war's momentum in ways Putin couldn't have anticipated. He was happy to keep throwing soldiers into the meat grinder while whittling away at Ukraine's defenses in Donetsk. That's still an option, though it comes with the ever-increasing threat that Ukraine will break through elsewhere. That brings us to another way that Ukraine's Kursk invasion has changed everything. It's the first time since February 2022 that Ukraine has had any leverage. In May 2024, Reuters reported that several sources within the Kremlin believed that Putin was open to negotiating a ceasefire with Ukraine. One of those sources, who remained anonymous, claimed that Putin can fight for as long as it takes to claim Ukraine, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war. Putin himself seemed to confirm this when quizzed about the source's comments while in Belarus, saying that peace talks could resume, but only if they were based on the realities on the ground. This was Putin's way of telling the world that he would have all of the leverage in any negotiations that took place. Russia had already taken much of South Ukraine and was advancing deeper into the Donbass. He was in a position of power. Putin could set the terms because Ukraine had no leverage aside from the aid it was receiving from the West. That changed on August 6th. Ukraine now controls 28 villages in Russia, and is still advancing through Kursk, along with a key gas transmission station. If negotiations were to begin now, it would finally have something to hold above Russia. Ukraine could ask for Russia to withdraw from some of the locations it's fortified in Donetsk in return for Ukrainian soldiers withdrawing from Kursk, for instance. That leverage couldn't come at a better time for Ukraine. It faces the possibility of Donald Trump being re-elected as US president, which creates uncertainty that isn't helped by Trump's claims that he could end the Ukraine war within a day if he was elected. Nobody knows what that means, and Ukraine is rightfully wary of what a change in the political structure of the US could mean for the support it's receiving from America. That uncertainty is compounded by events in Europe, the national interest points out. Several European countries that support Ukraine are due to hold elections, or have already held them, in 2024. Leadership changes could create problems for Ukraine, as those changes lead to the re-examination of support these countries are delivering. Add to that the fact that Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán now holds the European Union's rotating presidency. Orbán has maintained ties with Putin throughout the war, to the point where he would be considered something of an ally to Russia. As recently as July 2024, the Hungarian Prime Minister traveled to Moscow and shook Putin's hand in what Orbán calls a peace mission. This is a man who already blocked the EU from sending $55 billion in aid to Ukraine in December 2023, and it's very likely he'll argue to continue for the EU to limit the funding it provides to Ukraine in the future. These changing political tides must worry Ukraine. So by taking territory in Kursk, it's working to minimize the impact that changes in European or US politics might have. That's bad news for Putin. He was likely relying on his friendly relationship with Orbán to limit the support the EU could provide, while hoping for political turmoil in the US to do the same. He didn't account for Ukraine gaining leverage outside of its Western allies, meaning he has to face up to the fact that his position at the negotiating table has changed. He's still in the driver's seat if negotiations do occur, but now he would likely need to concede territory in Ukraine to regain the lost territory in Kursk, essentially setting the slow advances made in Donetsk back again. And this brings us to the final reason that the Kursk invasion has changed everything about the Ukraine war, why it's such a massive humiliation for Putin, and why he may never recover from the situation. Putin has lost his strongman image. We've touched on this concept already. In politics, a strongman is a leader, typically authoritarian, who not only claims to have strong popular support, but relies on military enforcement to maintain their control. Through that military support, they're able to claim themselves as the only person who is capable of solving whatever a country's problems may be. In Putin's case, that problem has changed over the years. Earlier in his reign, he tackled issues related to Russia's economy, but from the late 2000s through to today, that problem has evolved to focus on Russian sovereignty. Putin's invasion of Georgia in 2008 saw him cast himself as the strongman while waging war against another nation. The same goes for the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Putin was taking back territory that rightfully belonged to Russia, according to his own political dogma. The Ukraine war was meant to be an extension of Putin's strongman position, reinforcing him as the leader for life in Russia. Instead, Ukraine has whittled away at the image Putin has so carefully crafted. By crossing red lines, it's shown that Putin's bark is worse than his bite, which is a message that Europe and the US have taken on board. By staging such a solid defense against the far larger Russian forces, Ukraine has also demonstrated that Putin's military threat isn't as powerful as once thought. The Russian military is increasingly looking like a paper tiger, a military that looks strong on paper, but is far weaker when put to the test. With Ukraine's invasion of Kursk comes yet another chink in the strongman's armor. For so many years, Putin has positioned himself as the protector of the Russian people, a man who would ensure they came to no harm, even as he pushed aggressive policies externally. That image has been shattered. Thousands of Russians are being evacuated, and Ukraine is driving deeper into his country. Even if Russia manages to push Ukraine out of Kursk, Putin faces a political future in which doubt can be cast on his leadership. That doubt is the enemy of the authoritarian leader, and it could slowly lead to Russia's people losing confidence in Putin. He isn't helping himself. As The Guardian pointed out in an article on August 13th, Putin easily won Russia's presidential elections in March 2000 and has held onto power with an iron grip ever since. But it's now over 24 years later, and Russia finds itself staring down the barrel of a gun that represents so many of the problems it faced when Putin first took power. There is war, just as there was in September 1999, when Russia was bombing the Chechen capital of Grozny. Only now, the war is on a grander scale, and Russia is finding itself fighting on its own territory for the first time since World War II. As for Putin's response, it's been lackluster at best. At the time of the writing of this script, we're entering the 9th day of the Kursk invasion. Ukraine isn't being pushed back. If anything, it's gaining more territory, showcasing how poor Russia's defenses are. And the best Putin can muster is a promise to provide a 10,000 ruble handout to those who are affected. That amounts to $109, a pittance for people who are now facing losing their homes. The strong man has been brought to his knees by the Kursk invasion. Only time will tell if he is able to get back up, or if Ukraine's invasion of Kursk truly stands as a pivotal moment in Putin's presidency. With that, we turn the questions over to you. What do you think the situation in Kursk means for the Ukraine war and Putin's future? Will Ukraine launch further invasions on the back of this success, and is it possible that Putin will be forced to the negotiating table in the wake of these events?
The Ukraine war has followed the same pattern for over 2 years. Ever since Russian President Vladimir Putin began his special military operation, the war has been a constant series of attacks on Ukrainian territory. Each one of those attacks has been met the same way. A valiant Ukrainian defense attempts to repel the Russian invaders. The defense works most of the time. However, we can't ignore the fact that Russia has taken key territory in Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass, where it controls the majority of the major city of Donetsk.
All told, Russia is believed to control around 18% of Ukraine, and it claims to have taken 211 square miles in 2024 alone. But the tide of the war is turning. For the first time since February 2022, Ukraine has gone on the offensive and taken on Russia at its own game. Ukraine now holds territory in Kursk, which is a Russian oblast. Ukraine is now attacking Russia on Russian soil. Here we provide a day-by-day analysis of the Ukrainian invasion of Russia. August 6, 2024. A major turning point in the Ukraine war was coming, only it wasn't the turning point that everybody expected. August 6 saw Ukraine begin flying operations with F-16 fighter jets for the first time. Those jets had been a long time coming, but they would finally provide Ukraine with options, both in attacking Russia behind the war's front lines and establishing some patches of aerial dominance. The emergence of those jets was the big news of the day. But bubbling under the surface was something much more important. Reports started surfacing that a small contingent of Ukrainian troops had breached Russia's border defenses and attempted to make their way into Kursk. We say attempted because the early reports came from Russia. Acting Kursk governor Alexei Smirnov said that about 300 Ukrainian troops, backed by a convoy of 11 tanks and more than 20 armored vehicles, had approached the Russian border. They were repelled, according to Smirnov, who said, "Fighters from the FSB border guards and the Russian armed forces prevented the border from being breached." More details emerged from the MASH Telegram channel. It claimed that the attempted invasion had resulted in the deaths of 20 saboteurs, along with injury for a further 50. Ukraine also shelled the small town of Sudza, damaging residential buildings and killing 5 people, in addition to sending a fleet of drones, 26 of which were supposedly shot down. It appeared that Russia had repelled a small-scale invasion attempt. But like so much of the information to come out of Russia, the initial reports about the Kursk invasion were incorrect. The Ukrainian army had entered Russian territory and, far from being repelled, it was actively advancing. August 7, 2024. Russia kept up the pretense of having successfully repelled the Ukrainian invaders. Smirnov claimed the situation in the region he oversaw was controllable, even though Ukraine had maintained a campaign of aerial attacks on Kursk with shelling and fleets of drones. Ukraine was oddly silent, leading many to wonder if the attempted invasion had happened at all, and if it had, whether it was one approved by Kyiv. The days to come would soon see that approval was granted and Ukraine had been successful. But for now, confusion reigned. Moscow still claimed to have repelled the invasion, with Putin going on record to call the attempt a major provocation. This is typical of the Russian leader. He ignored the constant flood of soldiers and equipment he sent to Ukraine to unleash an empty threat about how Ukraine giving him a dose of his own medicine would end badly. Ivor Bennett, a Sky News Moscow correspondent, speculated that Russia had been forced to move troops and send reservists to thwart the Ukrainian invasion. That may have been the goal all along. With Russia focusing on capturing more territory in Donetsk, he posited, Kyiv may have decided to launch a false invasion to divert troops and give itself some breathing room. It would soon become clear that there was nothing false about what was happening in Kursk. August 8, 2024. Still, no official comment on the Kursk invasion from Kyiv, but a comment wasn't needed. It was rapidly becoming apparent to the Western media that Russia's claims of repelling the Ukrainian invasion were false. Not only had it failed to stop Ukraine, but its enemy was quickly gaining ground and taking territory within Russia. Smirnov had offered the first signs that all was not as Russia claimed. Toward the end of August 7th, he declared a state of emergency in Kursk, a clear sign that Ukrainian troops were in the territory and making gains. August 8th saw clashes intensify, with Ukraine typically coming out on top. Interestingly, the first signs of approval of the invasion also came. Speaking to reporters, European Commissioner spokesperson Peter Stano said, Ukraine is fighting a rightful defensive war based on international law. Ukraine has a right to defend itself, and this right to defend itself includes hitting the enemy on its own territory. This is exactly what Ukraine was doing. In addition to evacuating 6,000 people from the northeastern region of Sumy, which sits on the border between Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine was going on the offensive. Reports emerged that it had taken the Sudza gas hub, which lies about 4.9 miles behind the border and is key to Gazprom's European gas network. Almost all of the natural gas the Russian state-owned energy company sells to Europe flows through that hub. Ukraine now held it, along with almost 24 small villages and settlements. Reports also started coming in that Ukraine was deeper than expected in Russian territory. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, claimed Ukrainian soldiers had been spotted up to 6.2 miles deep into Kursk. Other sources, such as Politico, claimed the incursion was even deeper. Ukrainian soldiers have been spotted in the village of Bolshosoldatsky, which lies almost 25 miles into Russian territory. It was finally clear, Ukraine hadn't just attempted to invade Russia. It had succeeded and was now advancing while maintaining hold of several territories. And although Kyiv still hadn't made an official comment, it was clear the invasion was approved. Oleksiy Goncharenko gave the first indication, saying on Telegram, "Kursk region, day 3, everything is according to plan." August 9, 2024. More details began to emerge about Ukraine's invasion. Up to 1,000 Ukrainians had entered Kursk, far more than the 300 Russia claimed to have repelled, and they were backed by dozens of armored vehicles. Far from having fought back against the invasion, it was clear that Russia had been taken completely by surprise. The full picture remained murky, but it was clear at least that Ukraine was advancing far deeper than official messaging from the Kremlin would suggest. Ukraine was also starting to expand its incursions. Crimea had been an obvious target for Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Annexed by Russia in 2014, the territory was formally under Ukrainian control, and it's clear Ukraine wants it back. August 9th saw Ukraine unleash a drone attack on the port city of Sevastopol, which is home to many of the ships in Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Russia claimed to have destroyed 3 drone boats and 3 aerial drones in the assault. Drones were also being used to attack other Russian territories, including Lipetsk and Belgorod. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed to have shot down 75 drones over those territories. Whether that was true has never been established, though the drone assault showed that Ukraine was looking to take more than a handful of settlements in Kursk. Multiple detonations along with a severe fire were also seen at Russia's Lipetsk airport. Ukraine later took credit for the massive drone attack that caused them. More information about Ukrainian tactics in Russia also started to emerge. The ISW noted that armored Ukrainian groups were advancing via the Russian rear, bypassing poorly guarded fortifications in the process before engaging the Russian soldiers on their own terms. These small groups weren't consolidating the territory they captured, rather they would attack and move on, forcing Russia to continuously divert troops to try and deal with the confusion. Those small groups would be followed by much larger ones which could then consolidate the attacked territory. It was now obvious that Ukraine's incursion into Kursk wasn't just a temporary raid. It was a full-blown invasion, one that had seen it capture at least a dozen settlements and likely more as part of a concerted campaign. August 10, 2024. Russia continued to claim it was repelling the Ukrainian attacks even as the evidence mounted that it was losing territory. Finally, August 8th brought word from the White House, with Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh being asked if the Pentagon was concerned that Russia would escalate now Ukraine was in its territory. Her answer? No, because at the end of the day, Ukraine is fighting for its sovereign territory that its neighbor invaded. It was yet another approval for Ukraine's approach, though one that came with the caveat of Washington claiming to have had no advanced knowledge of the attack. By August 10th, Russia started sending extra forces into Kursk, with reports emerging that some of the soldiers were transporting Grad multiple rocket launch systems, alongside tanks and artillery, into the region. News also emerged that Russia had evacuated over 76,000 people from the Kursk region, with Russia also claiming that it had used a thermobaric bomb on the invading Ukrainian forces. Reuters also reported that Ukraine had sent several thousands more troops into Kursk, with some being embedded as deep as 12 miles into Russian territory. Belarus was also drawn into the invasion, albeit in a small way. Its president and Putin supporter Alexander Lukashenko claimed his country's air defenses had shot down several unspecified objects launched from Ukraine that flew over Belarus. "I do not understand why Ukraine needs this," Lukashenko claimed. "We need to figure it out. As I said before, we made it clear to them that any provocations will not go unanswered." This is from a man who allowed his country to be used as a launching pad for Putin's special military operation. August 11, 2024. Official confirmation of the Kursk invasion finally came from Kyiv. While addressing the nation, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said, "Today I received several reports from Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky regarding the front lines and our actions to push the war onto the aggressor's territory. Ukraine is proving that it can indeed restore justice and ensure the necessary pressure on the aggressor." The comments came on the same day that Russia's defense ministry claimed to have destroyed 14 Ukrainian drones along with 4 Tochka-U ballistic missiles over the Kursk region. Russia failed to destroy everything Ukraine sent, however, with the ministry claiming that the drones and missiles that got through injured 13 people, with one missile destroying a 9-story residential building. Note Russia's claims that the attackers are targeting residential buildings. It's clear from this point that Putin was attempting to paint Ukraine as a country that goes after civilian targets. In Belarus, Lukashenko was making good on his promise to respond to Ukrainian drones flying over his territory. He sent troops to reinforce the border Belarus shares with Ukraine, though no fighting occurred. Reports also started emerging that the Kremlin was trying to downplay the Ukrainian invasion. Verstka, a Russian opposition outlet, claimed that Putin had recommended that his deputies and senators say nothing about what was happening until further notice. Elsewhere, Ukraine was advancing into other Russian territories. Newsweek reported that Ukraine's forces had pushed into Belgorod, another Russian oblast that sits further north than Kursk. Footage published on Telegram appeared to show Ukraine's soldiers in the village of Poroz, which is about a mile inside Russia and 60 miles away from the Sudza gas station in Kursk. The video was accompanied by a message. With best wishes, the 252nd Battalion is in the Poroz settlement in the Belgorod region. Kursk was no longer the only Russian territory on the Ukrainian agenda. Subsequent reports would reveal that Ukraine engaged in a shelling campaign against Poroz, resulting in 4 people being injured. Professor Clark, a Sky News security and defense analyst, claimed that Ukraine's Kursk invasion had seen it go 15 miles deep into Russian territory while establishing a new front line that was at least 35 miles long. He also notes that Ukraine has sent the equivalent of around 3 or 4 brigades into Kursk, with all containing top-level elite troops. More images of Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk also started appearing, including a photograph of a tank firing before it gets engulfed in a massive smoke plume, showcasing just how intense the fighting had become. And of course, Putin continued his hypocritical comments about Ukraine's actions. Russia's defense ministry labeled the Kursk invasion barbaric, while claiming that it made no military sense, at least none that Russia could see. The day wrapped up with a report from the Kursk offices of the Red Cross. It had received nearly 3,000 calls in less than 24 hours from worried Russian citizens. August 12, 2024. By this point, Putin could no longer shy away from the humiliating blow dealt to him and his presidency by the Kursk invasion. His declaration that Russia would launch a counter-terrorism operation against the Ukrainian invaders stopped short of a declaration of war within Russia. But it was an official acknowledgement. Ukraine was doing more damage than Putin and his cronies had initially claimed. Away from Kursk, mass evacuations began in Belgorod, with the region's leader, Vyacheslav Gladkov, announcing on Telegram that the enemy is active on the border of the Krasnoyarski district. The Poroz settlement capture was no smokescreen or false invasion. It had actually happened, and Belgorod now faced a similar fate to Kursk. Further justification for the Kursk invasion also came from Zelensky, who pointed out that Ukraine's Sumy region had absorbed around 2,000 strikes emanating from Kursk in the summer of 2024 alone. The invasion was dubbed a fair response, and one that would potentially allow Ukraine to establish new and stretched front lines in advance of winter. Russia's defense ministry also made more claims of shooting down drones. Overnight, it said it destroyed 5 drones over Belgorod and a further 11 over Kursk, though it didn't say whether any of those drones reached their targets. That omission likely means that they did. As August 12th progressed, more details about the Belgorod evacuation emerged. Residents were told that they faced a missile threat from Ukraine, leading to around 11,000 people leaving their homes in the Krasnoyarski district. Around 500 remained by midday, according to Sky News, showcasing just how much of an effect Ukraine's invasion has had. The day was rounded out by Kursk acting governor Smirnov telling Putin that Ukraine now controlled 28 settlements in the oblast via video conference. At the same time, Ukraine was claiming to now control around 386 square miles of territory in Kursk. China also chimed in, calling on all parties to avoid further escalation while claiming that Beijing would continue to play a constructive role in facilitating a political settlement of the crisis. August 13, 2024. The day began with reports that Ukrainian soldiers were taking down Russian flags in settlements across Kursk. Elsewhere, the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, revealed that Putin had received advance warning that Ukraine intended to invade Kursk, but had essentially chosen to do nothing with the information. RUSI Senior Associate Fellow Mark Galeotti said that Putin thought it was going to be a short and minor raid. Instead, he'd been caught with his pants down as Ukraine swept through a poorly defended Russian oblast. More drone attacks had been launched overnight, according to Russia's defense ministry, which claimed that it had destroyed 12 over the Kursk, Belgorod, and Voronezh regions. A third region was now in play, though Russia chose to omit any information regarding the potential success of those drones. It did respond in kind, though, sending 38 drones and a pair of Iskander-M ballistic missiles into Ukraine in a counterstrike during the early hours of the morning. News also started emerging that Kursk evacuees were being provided with temporary lodgings, with some as far away as Azov, which is a small town nearly 500 miles away from Kursk. Russia also continued to threaten further escalation while providing zero specifics when its foreign intelligence service claimed that Zelensky is taking crazy steps that threaten to escalate far beyond Ukraine. Or in other words, Russia really doesn't like fighting the war it started within its own borders. Meanwhile, Zelensky had welcomed US Senators Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham to Kyiv, with the latter quipping that Zelensky should "remind me not to invade Ukraine," while calling the Kursk invasion a bold and brilliant move. By this point, Ukraine was also focusing on defending what it had gained, restricting civilian movement in the previously mentioned Sumy region to guard against Russian counterattacks. More people were also evacuated from Kursk, bringing the number fleeing that region up to over 100,000, and Ukraine began claiming that it controlled far more settlements than Smirnov stated in his call with Putin. Ukrainian Chief of Staff Oleksandr Syrsky told Zelensky during a video call that Ukraine actually held 74 settlements. Inspections and stabilization measures are carried out there, claimed Zelensky's chief, who also added that Ukraine had taken 15.4 square miles of Russian territory over the previous 24 hours. The day ended with reports that Russia was starting to move troops from Kaliningrad to Kursk to deal with the invasion. For context, Kaliningrad is a Russian oblast that's separated from the country's mainland, instead being surrounded by Poland and the Baltic states. Removing soldiers from that oblast was a desperate move. It meant a key piece of Russian territory was no longer as well defended as it was previously. August 14, 2024, a new state of emergency was declared. This time it was in Belgorod, which had been the subject of a secondary invasion that was successful enough for the region's head, Vyacheslav Gladkov, to take to Telegram and appeal to Putin to declare a federal state of emergency. That request was granted amidst Putin condemning Ukraine's Western allies for remaining silent over Ukraine's actions. They hadn't, most had approved even if they weren't directly involved. US President Joe Biden called the Kursk incursion a real dilemma for Putin, showing that the West was far from being silent. More support came from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who simply said Ukraine's actions are defensive during an interview with Polski radio. Russia also claimed that peace talks would now be on hold due to the invasion, as though they were progressing in the first place. The Wall Street Journal also revealed that Moscow was continuing to pull troops from elsewhere to fight the Ukrainians in Kursk, including from Ukraine itself. If Ukraine's goal was to divert Moscow's attention from its activities in places like Donetsk and Kherson, it was clearly working. Meanwhile, Ukraine's troops were continuing their invasion. The country's general staff claimed that an overnight combat mission in Kursk had resulted in the destruction of a $30 million Su-34 fighter. Ukraine also announced that it had captured 100 Russian soldiers in Kursk during the previous day's fighting, adding to a total of nearly 1,000 captures since the invasion began. 4 Russian airfields were also reportedly targeted via drone attacks, though Sky News said it was unable to verify the claims. If true, they demonstrate that Ukraine was taking a methodical approach to the invasion that included destroying any chance Russia would have of securing aerial dominance. These sites were later identified as Savoslayka, Kalino, Baltimore, and Borisoglebsk. More backing for Ukraine's actions came throughout the day as the West continued to prove Putin's claims of silence wrong. Petteri Orpo, the Finnish Prime Minister, said that Ukraine had a right to self-defense that included the Kursk invasion, with those comments being backed by Estonian Prime Minister Kristen Michal. Reports also emerged that many of the soldiers Putin was sending to defend Kursk were inexperienced conscripts. That's another humiliation for Putin. He had previously claimed that new conscripts would not be expected to immediately serve on the front lines. Ukraine rounded out the day with the announcement that it would start creating security corridors for Kursk civilians, giving them the option to evacuate into Ukraine or escape the region by going deeper into Russia. August 15, 2024. Another day, another round of evacuations from Kursk. Reuters reported that the number had now reached 200,000, leading credence to the claims that Ukraine was moving ever deeper into the oblast. Satellite images also emerged of a series of anti-vehicle ditches and trenches being built in Lugov, which is around 10.5 miles north of the furthest Ukrainian advances into Kursk as of August 15th, according to the ISW. Russia was preparing for a fight deeper into its own territory. Elsewhere, a series of Sky News interviews with Russian prisoners of war captured in Kursk revealed the reality of the invasion from the Russian perspective. Many of those fighting against the elite Ukrainian soldiers were aged between 19 and 21, again showing Putin's willingness to throw inexperienced conscripts at Ukraine. Ukrainian officials also revealed that their convoy vehicles weren't large enough to transport all of the prisoners they were taking, necessitating several trips. Yet another humiliation for Putin. News also emerged that Ukraine had likely used British-made Challenger 2 tanks as part of the invasion. The UK Ministry of Defence declined to comment, though the UK had already made it clear that Ukraine could use the weapons it provides in any way it sees fit. Ukraine also claimed to have advanced another mile into Kursk territory in the previous 24 hours, in addition to setting up a military office to serve as a base for the invasion. Ukraine was bedding as Russia dawdled in its efforts to repel the country's forces. Finally, the capture of the Russian town of Sudza, home of the previously mentioned gas depot, was made official. A Ukrainian news channel released a video showing the country's troops unfurling the country's flags on one of the town's administrative buildings. Sudza is just 65 miles southwest of the city of Kursk. Russia wasn't sitting back though, at least according to the information it was putting out. The evening saw Russia claim it was using air-to-surface missiles against the invading Ukrainians, adding that all targets were neutralized. August 16, 2024. The world is on the brink of a third world war. Those were the words of Russian parliamentary deputy Mikhail Sheremet on August 16th, again demonstrating Russia's pattern of attempting to use threats and intimidation to quell the Kursk invasion. It didn't work. Russia's response to the invasion was derided as being ineffective and complicated by the ISW, while a Putin aide claimed that both the West and NATO had helped Ukraine plan the invasion. That isn't confirmed. Signs of pessimism began to emerge in Russia, with Karen Shakhnazarov warning, on Russian state television no less, that the country could lose if such blunders continue. If nothing else, Ukraine had severely demoralized Russia with a reality check of what the Ukraine war could really be with its invasion. Then came the big news of the day. Ukraine destroyed a bridge over the River Seym in Kursk, creating a logistical nightmare for Russia. Not only was that bridge no longer available to the country's troops, but it also couldn't be used for evacuations anymore. Footage of the strike was later published on Telegram to confirm that it had happened. August 17, 2024. 5 more Russian villages in Belgorod were evacuated overnight, continuing that region's descent into a state of emergency. The Russian Foreign Ministry was also quick to claim that Ukraine had used Western-made rocket launchers to destroy the Seym River bridge, though this wasn't independently verified. Speaking in a video to address his nation, President Zelensky discussed how the Kursk invasion was designed to cause maximum damage to all Russian positions, as he confirmed that strikes on key logistical sites such as the Seym River Bridge and the previously mentioned airfields were part of that approach. Beyond that, little else happened on this day, which appeared to be more about consolidating positions than causing active damage in Kursk. August 18, 2024. Reports of a fire at an oil depot in Rostov emerged during the morning. Russia claims that it was caused by the debris from drones it shot down, with Governor Vasily Golubov stating that firefighters had been sent to the location to get the blaze under control. They would fail, with the blaze only growing in size in the coming days. A second Russian bridge over the same river, this one located in Zvanoye, also came under Ukrainian fire, with an enormous hole being blown into it by Ukraine's air force. Meanwhile, President Lukashenko increased his reinforcement of the Belarusian border, sending 120,000 troops to guard against a possible Ukrainian incursion. At least that's what some reports claimed. Ukraine later dismissed the reports as false, stating that Lukashenko was simply trying to appease Putin by crafting an illusion of power. Back in Kursk, another 3,000 civilians were evacuated, with Zelensky claiming that Ukraine was still inflicting losses on Russia in the territory. August 19, 2024. Confirmation came that the bridge in Zvanoye had been destroyed, marking another blow for Ukraine against Kursk's logistical systems. By this point, the shock and awe of the invasion had worn off, giving way to an improved, methodical approach in which Ukraine more carefully picked its targets. The late morning of August 19th brought with it reports that Ukraine had targeted a third bridge over the same river. A clear pattern emerged. Ukraine was cutting off access to the territory it had taken. Beyond that, the news contained little more than confirmation of the evacuation of some 121,000 people from Kursk, along with more claims from Putin that peace talks would be impossible as long as Ukraine remained in Kursk. August 20, 2024. This day was marked by more Russian strikes in Ukraine than attacks in Kursk. An overnight attack in the Sumy region left 18,500 Ukrainians without electricity, with Russia also launching what would prove to be its 5th missile strike on Kyiv in August. The fire at the Rostov oil depot continued to rage, engulfing 20 of the reservoir's 74 tanks and injuring 41 people. By August 20th, Russia had sent around 500 firefighters to the blaze and still didn't have it under control. As for the Kursk invasion, it had slowed, but Ukraine was making marginal advances, according to the ISW. By the end of the day, the country claimed to hold around 480 square miles of Russian territory, which included 92 settlements in Kursk alone, and that it had advanced up to 21 miles into the Kursk Oblast. August 21, 2024. Perhaps August 20th was the calm before the storm. On August 21st, Russia's defense ministry claimed that Moscow had come under attack by Ukrainian drones. Of course, it also claimed to have shot them all down, saying 11 were destroyed over Moscow, with a further 34 taken out of the skies over Kursk, Kaluga, Belgorod, and Bryansk. If true, it's clear that Ukraine is slowly extending the scope of its invasion to include other major Russian territories. News also came that Ukraine destroyed an S-300 anti-aircraft system in Rostov overnight. The UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD, also analysed Russia's response to the Kursk invasion, claiming that said response created a bad look for Putin. Diverting personnel from previously high-priority areas likely demonstrates continuing personnel shortages, the MOD claimed while pointing out that Putin had started misusing specialist motor rifle regiments as infantry to cover the Russian shortfall in Kursk. Russia also started setting up pontoon bridges, which are temporary floating bridges, though these soon came under Ukrainian attack. By mid-afternoon, Russia had restricted airspace over the northwestern cities of Apatity and Murmansk, which is usually an indicator that it expects Ukrainian drone strikes in those locations. That concludes the day-by-day analysis of Ukraine's invasion of Russia so far. If one thing is clear, it's that Russia has failed to repel Ukraine's forces. One question remains: how long can Ukraine hold the territory it's taken? For 2 years, Vladimir Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons, and now 1,000 square kilometers of Russia are in the hands of Ukrainian forces. In one brilliant military maneuver, Ukraine has managed to expose Putin for the weak, ineffectual leader that he is, and the question the whole world is wondering is, what happened to Putin's red lines? The invasion of Kursk is the most stunning development in the Ukraine war since the Ukrainian Armed Forces, or UAF, launched its stunningly successful counteroffensive in the fall of 2022, exposing the weaknesses of the Russian military to the world. Yet Ukraine has been heavily criticized for redirecting badly needed troops and equipment from the front lines to the east to carry out the invasion of Russia, prompting many to ask if it's even worth it. Misconceptions about Russia and war itself fuels this speculation. If exposing Vladimir Putin's red lines is a sham wasn't victory enough, observers need to understand that war is not a binary choice between battles to fight. The conflict in Ukraine has pushed both nations to their limits, and the lack of a coordinated and strong military response by Russia to invasion of its territory proves what many analysts have speculated for a long time now. Russia's reserves are nearly completely out. When one would have expected the rapid deployment of reserves from the front in Ukraine to the Kursk Oblast, instead we've seen evidence of frontline units being thinned out along the less intense part of the front line in the East Ukraine, as well as a mad dash to coordinate a slapdash response to the invasion with a mix of conscripts, regular army forces, interior ministry forces, private military companies, Chechen units, National Guard, and FSB border troops. It was speculated that Russia would simply redirect large numbers of troops from its northern grouping of forces that were in May threatening an invasion of Kyiv, yet this does not seem to have been the case as of the writing of this script on August 17th. The northern grouping was planned to have a force of 75,000 to score a definitive victory in Kyiv via a cross-border invasion from Russia, yet intelligence estimates that at most Russia only managed to put together between 20 to 50,000 troops, with the best intelligence pointing at around 35,000. This force, however, suffered significant attrition in the attempt to invade Kyiv, with President Biden approving the use of American long-range weapons against Russian troop formations inside the Russian border. Russia, which had believed itself invulnerable inside of its own border due to Putin's constant nuclear threats and Western fears of escalation, was caught completely by surprise, and the northern grouping suffered significant casualties in a blistering long-range strike campaign involving volley after volley of artillery and HIMARS, among other weapons. The lack of a sizable response from the northern grouping to the Kursk invasion strongly indicates that the force massed for a Kharkiv invasion are no longer capable of large-scale maneuvers. Russia and Vladimir Putin's military weakness is on full display to the world, and the situation is dire. For months there have been reports of Russian units stationed along the border with NATO countries being thinned out, with soldiers and equipment redeployed to Ukraine. This runs in direct contrast with Putin's constant narrative about NATO threatening Russia militarily, yet more propaganda meant to justify his invasion of Ukraine and rile up the domestic population, while skewing public opinion among the less informed in the West. Despite Finland joining NATO and Russia technically being the most militarily vulnerable it's been in centuries, Russian units along the shared border have been constantly redeployed to Ukraine. Even in the Kaliningrad enclave, itself a perilous Russian toehold in Europe, Russian units, aircraft and missiles have been consistently retasked for service in Ukraine. It's a significant public relations failure for the West to not have made this information more public as to help fight Russian disinformation attempts and make it clear that not only did NATO never pose a military threat to Russia, but that even Russia never believed that it did. This is an incredibly important narrative to drive home in parts of the world where Russian disinformation has been most effective, the global South. From Africa to South America and even Southeast Asia, Russian propaganda narratives remain louder and more convincing than the truth, distorting global opinion on the war in Ukraine and NATO both. The Kursk invasion has significantly complicated the war in Ukraine for Russia and compounded its many weaknesses while exposing more of Putin's. Putin took 3 days to respond publicly to the invasion and did not bother to appoint a head of a military response to the invasion for over a week. This was a stunning error on his behalf, and it's allowed Ukrainian forces to run roughshod over Kursk's unorganized defenders. Putin's weakness, though, is almost certainly a reflection of Russia's weakness. The initial response to the invasion seems to have been an uncoordinated mess between regular army forces largely made up of conscripts, FSB border guards, and irregular forces such as PMCs and Chechen units. Per Ukrainian battlefield sources, the Russians lacked any coordination between the disparate groups, making them easy prey for the UAF's professional combined arms maneuver into Kursk. A common folly of dictatorships is a lack of honesty and accountability among the lower ranks, which directly impedes the flow of information to the head of state. It's likely that nobody was telling Putin the truth about the invasion because nobody wanted to be blamed for it, or speak contrary to the government narrative that it was a minor event and that the UAF were already being contained. A lack of clear joint command structure inside of the Russian government also impeded a coordinated response, and this could be either due to incompetence or by design. In the United States, authorities flow along clearly defined chains of command, unifying the disparate elements of the US armed forces and government support agencies. However, for a dictator like Putin, unified and clearly defined chains of command are a threat to his grip on power. He has learned well how many who came before him were undone by underlings holding the reins to various arms of the Russian government at once. Thus, power is kept divided and chains of command kept independent. The end result is that when crisis strikes, information does not flow freely and a response is unclear. Ukraine took full advantage of this to outmaneuver Russian forces. It's not just in Kursk, though, that we see evidence of Russia's difficulty in coordinating forces, as even inside of Ukraine amongst the branches and even different parts of each branch, Russia struggles to coordinate military maneuvers on a larger scale. The lack of reserves also highlights Putin's weakness, even as the Ukraine war shows no sign of slowing. Both nations are experiencing the same problem in this regard, with both militaries being fully committed. However, despite Russia's vastly larger industry and manpower pool, Ukraine is better positioned to be in a winning position, even if it cannot fully throw Russia out of its territory at the conclusion of hostilities. Ukraine has long delayed a wider mobilization due to its population crisis. The nation simply does not have enough young men to maintain the health of its economic future. Hence, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is around 40 years old, but the reality of war pressures in the east has forced Kyiv's hand, and a major mobilization drive began this summer, targeting younger conscripts. There has been some pushback from Ukrainian society as war weariness settles in, but there have been no major displays against mobilization, and most draftees report for duty as instructed, even if they first seek out an exemption at draft offices. Government and military insiders predict that Ukraine will be able to hit a target of 200,000 fresh recruits by year's end, with the largest concern being training and equipping them. Here, though, Ukraine's allies have already been stepping in. The United States has so far given over 100,000 sets of body armor, with another 25,000 sets transferred early this year. NATO instructors are also helping train Ukrainian troops in training areas around Europe and the US. A new NATO program launched in July of this year includes a force of 700 NATO instructors to train Ukrainian troops on NATO equipment and basic combat skills. The training of Ukrainian fighter pilots to fly the F-16 has been accelerated, with the first combat-coded jets already flying in the skies of Ukraine, if not taking part in missions yet as of mid-August. Despite challenges, Ukrainian morale remains high, even amongst frontline troops. But these troops are exhausted, with most not having been rotated out of the front in the entire 2.5 years of fighting. The call-up of freshly mobilized personnel will help relieve this incredible pressure, and victories in Kursk have raised morale significantly both among troops and the civilian population. By comparison, the Russian situation is far worse. Mobilization in Russia is a very sensitive subject, given the nation's disastrously high-cost wars in Afghanistan and Chechnya when measured in human lives. The well-known abuse of conscripts also helped sour the Russian population to the idea of mobilization, and when Russia launched its first mobilization at the close of year one of the war, Russian society reacted extremely poorly despite tight media and thought controls in the nation. Putin has worked very carefully to bolster his forces without drawing public ire. While conscripts have wound up in combat roles in Ukraine, Putin has gone to great lengths to avoid it happening after an initial outcry from Russian mothers when it was discovered conscripts had taken part in the original disastrous invasion. He even went so far as to meet with a group of them and personally apologize, promising to ensure it wouldn't happen again. Despite blatant and often extreme abuse of conscripts, the social contract between the Russian government and its people are that its conscripted teenagers and young adults are not to be sent to active combat and instead fulfill support roles inside of Russia itself. Thus, Putin has focused his efforts on volunteers, or in many cases, voluntolds. There are numerous disturbing cases, including some with video evidence, of conscripts forced into signing enlistment papers at the end of their conscription period. Coerced with threats or even outright violence, conscripts have routinely wound up on the front lines, with one key difference: they were now volunteer soldiers. Russian society can tolerate a truly apocalyptic level of casualties as long as they're seen as volunteers who fought and died by their own choice. If a conscript complains that they were forced to sign enlistment papers, the answer is typically something along the lines of "nobody can force you to do anything." These forced enlistees, though, are often quick to surrender or retreat, prompting the use of blocking forces to shoot any who refuse to take part in direct assaults. There are still a significant number of volunteers in Russia's army, though, even despite the staggering casualty rate. Extremely generous pay packages, financed by Russia's massive pre-war sovereign wealth fund, have been very appealing to many Russians, especially those living in remote regions. A single month's pay under current contracts can be as much as a full year's salary back home. Cleverly, though, Russia does not pay out a full contract up front and sends these high earners straight to the most dangerous parts of the fighting. Thus, it's rare for any of these volunteers to ever receive the full value of their contract before dying or becoming seriously injured. Recruitment efforts also show Putin's weakness. To date, the bulk of the Russian recruitment efforts have been towards rural populations and Russian minorities, as well as third-country nationals inside of Russia and around the world, lured into service with the promise of Russian citizenship upon completion. As in many places, these minorities are seen as less dead when casualty figures are tallied, because to Russian society they matter less than casualties of ethnic Russians or those from rich cosmopolitan cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. This pool of manpower, however, is drying up, and as Russian casualties mount at incredible rates, estimated to be between 1,000 and 1,500 a day, another mobilization becomes increasingly necessary if Russia is to avoid a total defeat in Ukraine. This scares Putin deeply, though, given how unpopular the first mobilization was, especially because this next mobilization will by necessity include a significant amount of the types of Russians that Russians care about, those living in the rich cities. The fact that no major mobilization was announced after the invasion of Kursk and the continued delay in assembling a response force indicates how terrified Putin is of being forced to announce a second wave, and how increasingly weak his grip on Russian power is becoming. Yet said mobilization is seen as inevitable, and as deliveries of Western weapons ramps up and restrictions on their use loosen, casualties of young Russians will mount, threatening to destabilize Russian society. Politically, the invasion of Kursk is the most catastrophic blow to Putin's legitimacy in the entire 25-year run of his hold on Russian power. The Russian military has always suffered from significant weaknesses, but a brilliant propaganda campaign had convinced the world otherwise for decades. Putin has historically leveraged the illusion of Russian might, despite disastrous campaigns in Chechnya and Georgia, to deter his political enemies and coerce nations once belonging to the Soviet bloc. In the West, Putin has managed to wage a brilliant propaganda campaign, resulting in the world's most powerful military alliance to self-deter from providing an aid to Ukraine out of fear of Russian retaliation, a real lion being afraid of the mouse scenario. Every aid package to date has resulted in endless deliberation and careful estimation of what a Russian response might be, carefully calculated to ensure that aid won't be too provocative to the Russian Federation and risk escalating the conflict. Never mind that Putin's army can't win victory against his much smaller neighbor, and NATO is the most powerful assembly of military forces to ever exist on Earth. Yet the invasion of Kursk has shattered Putin's bluffs, and might have been in fact one of the strategic objectives of Ukraine's armed forces. There is ongoing speculation as to whether the West was aware of this invasion or not as it was being planned, and we personally believe, based off the rapid delivery of what seemed like a prepared statement from the White House, as well as a lack of the typical hand-wringing, that the West was in fact aware, or at least key allies were. There's little other explanation for why Western equipment was among the first to roll into Russia, performing the role inside of Russian territory it had originally been designed to do. Germany, which still refuses to authorize the use of its Taurus missiles against targets it deems too provocative, has had none of the expected outcry after its Marder combat vehicles were seen inside of Kursk. Given how traditionally Germany has required written permission from Vladimir Putin for each German bullet fired by a Ukrainian soldier, the lack of outcry strongly insinuates that the West was well aware of the Kursk invasion before it happened. This likely means one very specific thing, and it's likely true even if the West was unaware of the planned invasion. This invasion has wider political goals outside of the war itself. To put it very simply, Ukraine cannot win this war under the terms currently imposed on it by NATO on the use of Western weapons. The early summer Russian offensive in Kyiv showed just how close to disaster Ukrainian forces had come, and it was entirely the fault of its Western allies. Restrictions on the use of Western weapons inside of Russia allowed the nation to gather its invasion forces completely free of consequence, and historically, Russia has used the invulnerability provided by its invisible border to mass forces, launch air attacks, and stage equipment, completely safe from Ukrainian attack due to fears in the West over escalation. Thankfully, President Biden saw the danger in allowing Kyiv to fall once again and swiftly authorized the use of American weapons inside Russian territories, under strict conditions. The would-be offensive, which was predicted to completely overwhelm Ukraine's defenses, was crushed by Ukrainian long-range strikes, destroying its troop concentrations and equipment staging areas. Further attacks against Russian airfields have forced its aviation to move further from the border and even destroyed some aircraft and a lot of munitions and fuel on the ground. The end result is Russian airstrikes have slowed considerably. By invading Kursk, Ukraine has shown that Putin's red lines do not exist and emboldened its allies to act more freely. Spurred by the success in Kursk, escalation-shy Germany has seen a resurgence in support for sending even more Leopard tanks to Ukraine, and President Biden is in the final stages of authorizing the sending of cruise missiles. In just 1 week of fighting inside of Russia itself, the 2-year-long self-deterrence the West imposed on itself has completely collapsed, and now it's simply a question of politicians catching up to the new reality on the ground, a reality where Vladimir Putin is weak and his threats empty.
The Ukrainian incursion into the Russian Kursk region during August, and technically still ongoing at the time of the producing of this video, is likely considered one of the most pivotal moments of the Russo-Ukrainian war in 2024 so far. The development has the potential to turn the tide of the war to Ukraine's advantage. When the invasion began on August 6th, many considered that it would be a temporary assault on enemy territory. After all, Kursk wasn't near the hot zone that is the Ukrainian Eastern Front, primarily the Donetsk region. The best explanation strategists could have at the time was that the Kursk incursion was a measure to force Putin to spread out his forces a bit more and provide much-needed relief to Ukrainian soldiers fighting to defend their homeland in eastern Ukraine. But nobody could have predicted what ended up happening. Within a few weeks, Ukraine managed to occupy roughly 500 square miles of Russian territory. That is, by all accounts, more than Russia has done throughout the entire year so far. The implications of this are many, but we'll get back to that a bit later, so keep watching. More importantly, recent interviews with Ukrainian President Zelensky suggest that Ukraine will keep occupying the territory indefinitely. No, that doesn't mean that they will try to force Russia to cede the Kursk region to Ukraine when it's all over. However, Kursk presents a long-lasting thorn in Russia's strategy, so Ukraine will keep its occupying forces at the ready to defend the area and keep control of it throughout the remainder of the war. It's obvious that the invasion of Kursk has been planned for a long time, all the while keeping those plans a secret from the US, ostensibly the largest Ukrainian ally. This comes straight from Washington, where President Joe Biden's administration denied knowing about any forward-moving plans from Ukraine. According to Zelensky, not even all Ukrainian intelligence services knew about the bold battle plan to invade Kursk. Zelensky noted that he shrunk to the maximum circle of people who knew about this operation and thinks it was one of the reasons why it was successful. And it's more than likely that this was by design too. Taking a back step to survey the bigger picture, the success of the Kursk invasion has a pretty clear catalyst. Putin didn't bother to provide more forces to defend it, but the implications of Russia's reasoning behind that reveal far more about Russia's ability to prolong this war than at first glance. So let's examine exactly how Ukraine invading and holding Kursk is going to be vital for the remainder of the Russo-Ukrainian war. We'll start with the Kursk invasion itself and what it meant for the progress of the war at the time. By late July 2024, Russia had spent a significant amount of resources trying to pile-drive its way further into eastern Ukraine. However, Putin made a significant error in judgment. He decided to advance on Kyiv again after the entire region was successfully defended by the Ukrainians. The scope of the attack was perplexing at best. The main stage of the campaign, subsequently dubbed the Summer Campaign, started in mid-May 2024, with small incursions into the Kyiv region by Russian forces. But that wasn't the weird part in and of itself. It was the tactics that Russia decided to implement that threw away any advantage it might have had. You see, for the past 30 months of the conflict, there was one advantage that Russia had and could rely on to drive forward: resource advantage. This came in many forms. Russia at that point was one of the most well-prepared national militaries in the world, easily ranking in the top 3 by sheer number of vehicles and airplanes it could field at any time. Sure, it quickly became clear that the main Russian tanks, T-72s, T-80s and T-90s, were no match for the advanced tanks like the M1 Abrams that the US could field.
After all three T-tanks suffered from a similar yet major design flaw that allowed Ukraine to drag the war into trench, mine, and drone warfare. The aforementioned tanks all use an automatic reloading system that houses spare ammunition below the turret. However, the ammunition housing is perilously undefended by battle armor. Since Ukraine also fielded some T-72s, as they are a Soviet design and were inherited after the collapse of the Union, the Ukrainian army quickly realized that a mine or a bomb could puncture through the housing and possibly detonate the armor. Despite this, Russia still had a significant field advantage with their tanks. Ukraine hasn't received nearly as many advanced tanks from the US and Europe as it hoped. Both sides of the war had to rely on Soviet-era machinery to take them through it, and Russia was the only side that could actually manufacture new parts. Russia's manufacturing and industry were advanced enough that Putin proclaimed that the military complex was prepared to deliver 1,500 tanks in 2023. Even if most of those tanks turned out to be refurbished Soviet-era models, Ukraine still had plenty to worry about if the Russian army decided to put all those tanks to use. But Russia didn't. The summer invasion turned out to be a mess of poor strategic decisions. Rather than pressing on with its tank advantage, Russia used mainly infantry-based tactics to try to invade Kyiv. According to field reports from Ukrainian soldiers after the summer invasion settled, some strategies went so far as to get soldiers on motorcycles so they could dodge Ukrainian fire and reach the trenches. The main armored vehicles were more akin to turtle tanks, slow but heavily fortified vehicles that only had the goal of soaking up fire for the surrounding infantry. It quickly became clear that the northern front was set up as a diversion for the main effort in eastern Ukraine. To end that, Russia eschewed trying to mount a more technologically or mechanically superior offensive on Kyiv. The goal was to pull as many Ukrainian defenders from the eastern front to the north so Donetsk could fall while it was undefended. On paper, this idea had merit, mainly due to another resource advantage Russia possessed: manpower. By the end of 2023, the Russian military was estimated to have around 1.3 million troops at its disposal, with the total military personnel surpassing 3 million people. This was largely due to Russia's aggressive conscription efforts, pulling in roughly 35,000 new soldiers every month, and the country's vast pools of mercenary companies. It didn't hurt that Russia has roughly twice the population of Ukraine, and therefore has the potential to pull from roughly twice as many people to make up its military. However, Russian troops seemed to be outmatched on the northern front, and there was one significant clue as to why: Russia was churning through experienced personnel. When the war started, Russia had around 300,000 troops stationed near Ukraine. These were, by all accounts, people who had extensive army training and knew what they were doing. But Ukraine managed to repel the initial onslaught, even if it took until the end of 2022 for Russia to withdraw from northern Ukraine. What followed was a meat grinder. By early 2024, Russian casualties were estimated to be anywhere from 450,000 to 500,000 people, counting both deaths and severe injuries. If we compare this to the earlier number of 300,000, it stands to reason that this could include a significant portion of experienced personnel. Therefore, Russia was likely using relatively new recruits to make up a bulk of its less critical efforts. And that seemed to be the case with the 2024 summer invasion of Kyiv. According to Ukrainian news outlet Ukrainska Pravda, Russia was losing between 1,000 and 1,200 soldiers every day over May and June. This was the sum of the losses on all fronts. When put together, the summer invasion cost Russia roughly 70,000 soldiers. By the end of July, it was probably clear to Ukraine that the Russian territory to its north was vastly under-equipped and its troops under-trained. The Kursk invasion all but confirmed that. The first wave of the Kursk incursion started with between 300 and 1,000 soldiers crossing the border and moving on to sparsely fortified villages and towns in the southwestern Kursk region. The initial reports were contradictory at best, partially because Ukraine refused to provide official information for the first few days of the incursion. The Russian Ministry of Defense started with reports on how Ukrainian troops were easily fended off and that there was no reason to worry about anything in the Kursk region. That quickly turned out to be as far from the truth as possible. The Kursk invasion turned out to be a wave of Ukrainian troops advancing through the Russian-populated area, with a wave of Russian soldiers surrendering in their wake. According to Kyiv's commander-in-chief, General Alexander Syrsky, the Ukrainian forces managed to capture 594 soldiers as prisoners of war. These troops are a useful tool for Ukraine to bolster its tactic of prisoner exchange, the first waves of which swapped 230 soldiers by August 24th. According to the Ukrainian prisons that are holding these Russian soldiers, roughly 80% of the initial wave of 300 captures is made up of recent recruits. This fact showcases that Ukraine's gambit turned out to be a stroke of genius. Kursk was defended by an army that wasn't trained and had no equipment to withstand Ukrainian shelling and advanced tactics. Ukraine has made several more offensive moves in the Kursk region, including bombing bridges and other vital parts of infrastructure that connects the southern parts of the region to the rest of Russia. This would give Ukraine ample opportunity to consolidate its existing gains in Kursk and take over more of Russia's territory to gain leverage. Throughout all of this, Ukraine has shown a more moral approach to warfare and invasion than Russia ever has over the past 30 months. The Ukrainian occupation has been estimated to have displaced nearly 200,000 civilians. To Ukraine's credit, the army has been working with international humanitarian organizations to expedite the process of providing aid for civilians. The military tactics have also included relatively little destruction of civilian infrastructure. By contrast, Russia has been accused of ignoring several clauses of international humanitarian law, the chief of which included targeting hospitals and shelling civilian buildings that had no military purposes. The discrepancy in how Russia was invading Ukraine and how Ukraine was invading Russia back was a significant advantage for Ukraine's corner of the conflict. This would undoubtedly help stir Ukraine's chief ally, NATO, into providing more aid for Ukraine. Throughout the Kursk invasion, Russia has been adamant about quelling the Ukrainian efforts to gain a larger foothold in its territory, but so far any attempts by Russia to drive away the troops have not yet yielded significant results. A month in, Ukraine has still managed to hold on to territory it seized, and it doesn't seem like it's going to let go anytime soon. But how does invading and holding parts of Kursk benefit Ukraine? We've already mentioned the first region, attention and the associated funding. Throughout the 30 months of warfare, Ukraine has been in the position of the defender, trying to remove Russia's presence from the country. In fact, some of its plans included making a counteroffensive and liberating part of the Russian-controlled territory. Ukraine publicly showed the narrative of wanting to repel Russia, and Russia was prepared for it. In August 2023, many strategists believed that Ukraine's efforts were for naught and the country was losing far more than it was gaining. Zelensky has noted that the Kursk incursion was precisely made as a strategy that went contrary to how Ukraine was behaving for the past 2 years. If Russia wasn't expecting Ukraine to mount a counter-invasion, and it clearly wasn't, then Ukraine could create an opening. And that's exactly what happened. The Kursk invasion has improved Ukraine's standing not only militarily but geopolitically. The US has announced that it would send another $125 million in military equipment and ammunition to Ukraine less than a week into the invasion. It ostensibly showed that the Biden administration was willing to back Ukraine in its bolder plan. Of course, Ukraine still needs all the help it can get. While Russia has been vocal about driving Ukraine out, the actual efforts have turned even more toward the Donetsk region. As Ukraine captured recruits to its north, Russia was sending more military to the east. The primary target over the past month has been the city of Pokrovsk, with a population of 60,000. The city stands at the crossroads between a few vital roads that connect eastern and central Ukraine. With Russia invading from the east, Pokrovsk has been made into a vital piece of Ukrainian military supply infrastructure. Putin has so far called the Ukrainian offensive on Kursk a mistake. Ukraine clearly sent more experienced units and advanced military equipment to Kursk, which precluded it from reinforcing its eastern front. Russia has seemingly capitalized on that, pushing to just 5 miles away from Pokrovsk. So far, Russia hasn't sent an overwhelming force to liberate Kursk in an attempt to maintain the pressure on the eastern front. Both sides are effectively playing chicken, as shuffling troops between the two fronts makes one liable to fall and creates a decisive result. But there's another aspect of the Russo-Ukrainian war that the Kursk invasion has managed to turn on its head. And it's likely the reason why Zelensky is so adamant about keeping the occupied territory under Ukrainian control until the war ends. The answer is, surprisingly, nuclear weapons. Throughout the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia has managed to stifle many attempts by NATO to supply Ukraine with advanced military equipment or overwhelming aid. As soon as NATO announced an aid package, Russia would claim that the new resources would present a significant threat to Russia's security and that Putin could launch nuclear weapons. This is part of Russia's 2020 military doctrine that outlines nuclear weapons as the preclusion of the escalation of military actions and their cessation on conditions acceptable to the Russian Federation and/or its allies. The sentence is a fancy way of saying that Russia has decided that it alone is responsible for determining when it decided something is dangerous enough for Russia to make a nuclear response a viable option. It was part of the reason why the US Congress has paused sending aid to Ukraine for 15 months. The saber-rattling tactic was working. Ukraine couldn't get the anti-air missiles, F-16s, Abrams tanks, and a host of other military equipment, or at least not in the numbers Zelensky hoped would be enough to make a difference. And one of the biggest red lines that Russia has drawn was Ukraine pushing onto Russian territory. Before July 2024, that's how it was. But all that went out the window the moment Ukraine managed to not only invade Russia, but occupy 500 square miles of it and keep it under control for over a month at the time of the making of this video. By Russia's own military doctrine and nuclear threats, this should have been enough to cause significant fallout, perhaps literally. But the threats of nuclear warfare remain just threats, and NATO can now see that. That's exactly why Ukraine is adamant about holding onto the territory it seized. It shows that Russia's threats are empty and that it would eventually have to mount a significant offensive to push the Ukrainian troops back across the border. Even better for Ukraine, one of the later responses by Russia was to make trenches around key parts of the region, including separating major roads or power plants. While this is a solid effort by Russia to minimize its losses in the region, it also gives more options to Ukraine. Considering the overall failure of the Russian military strategy to account for Ukraine pushing into Kursk, the new trenches could be used against Russia. If Ukraine manages to maintain momentum and capture areas surrounding the trenches, it can use them as fortifications against future Russian responses. In effect, Russia could end up spending more time, money and manpower to make Kursk more defensible, but against Russia itself. Recently though, Ukraine has revealed that there are a few more reasons why it wants to cling to Kursk. According to Syrskyi, Ukraine believed that Kursk was being set up as a launch pad for another invasion into Ukrainian territory later in the year. The decisive incursion has managed to both stifle that effort and force Russia to ease the pressure in other regions. Syrskyi has mentioned that Russia hasn't managed to make any progress towards Pokrovsk in the first week of September. This has showcased that Ukraine's strategy of occupying Kursk has worked past the short-term Russian response in August. Even more importantly, Ukraine's invading Russia has presented a significant morale shift in Russia's people. Before August, Russia was sternly on the offensive. This meant that Russian citizens, particularly those from Moscow and other heavily urban areas, weren't nearly as affected by the wartime atmosphere. In fact, Russia's conscription efforts overwhelmingly targeted poorer regions, typically populated by minorities. In some reports, there was an estimate that a conscript from Siberia was more than 50 times more likely to die than a Muscovite, purely because there weren't that many Muscovites in the more recent waves of conscription. Ukraine being able to hold Kursk will possibly show Russian citizens that they do have something to fear after all, and that the war could reach their doorstep. This isn't an empty threat either. On August 21st, Ukraine mounted a drone attack directly on the Russian capital. The 11 deployed drones were shot down by Russian anti-air defenses before they could reach their targets, which remain unidentified. However, this sets up a dangerous precedent for Russia. Apart from Ukraine holding onto Kursk, it could use it to strike deeper into Russia's territory. Ukraine has been successful in obtaining the much-needed missiles and long-range capabilities, as well as developing a line of long-range military drones. And more importantly, Ukraine has fortified its air presence as the F-16s have finally started taking flight in August. While Ukraine has received fewer F-16s from NATO, none from the US itself, the fleet of 65 aircraft will be a sizable boost to Ukraine's air forces. After all, the F-16 is considered one of the most advanced fourth-generation fighter jets, especially being more cost-effective and maneuverable than its Russian rival, the Su-27. The influx of F-16s will allow Ukraine to maintain a firmer grip on its hard-fought territory and remove yet another of Russia's advantages from the war equation. So where does that put Russia? Russia might still have the material advantage after all. Its military is practically being rebuilt every day and its numbers are going strong. However, the recent waves of NATO military aid have quickly closed the gap between Russia and Ukraine's technological capabilities. Both sides are increasingly relying on long-distance strikes, particularly drone warfare, which almost removes traditional infantry from the equation. While Russia has managed to land one of the more devastating missile strikes of the war, killing 51 people and injuring 270, Ukraine's efforts have been nothing short of spectacular. Ukraine has carved its way through Russia's navy with sea-deployed drones, freeing up vital ports in the south to reopen maritime trade and refresh its economy. The country has also received more than $250 billion in funding from the US and European countries, whether in military or direct financial aid, helping it to stay afloat. On the other hand, Russia has been relying on its energy sector and trading oil and natural gas to China and India, as Western sanctions dried up the influx of US dollars into Russia. While Russia's economy has momentarily bounced back, breaking the International Monetary Fund's predictions, this is unlikely to remain a viable long-term strategy. Russia's reliance on external trade with China means that it's dependent on staying in China's graces, and that China will actively continue to need Russia's resources. Based on China's recent spearheading of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Middle East might overtake Russia as China's biggest supplier in oil and gas. If that happens, Russia will lose much of its trade income. The energy sector, which is practically the only external-facing industry in the country, can collapse in on itself and drag the rest of the country down with it. And this threat of Russian collapse is exactly what Ukraine is hoping to accentuate by keeping Kursk under Ukrainian control. If Russia can't overwhelm Ukraine militarily and lets it hold on to parts of Russia, the political losses, both internal and external, could be too much for Putin's regime to handle. Zelensky seems to be fully aware of that and has been hinting at Kursk being a part of the wider plan to propose a peace agreement with Russia. With the next peace summit being held in November, Zelensky is clearly expecting that Ukraine will be able to maintain its grip on Kursk until then. If that remains true, Russia will be under increasing pressure over the coming months to determine how long it can keep the war going and whether its efforts are worth it after all. But what do you think? Will Ukraine be able to hold Kursk? Will Russia agree to hold peace negotiations in November? Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons if America gives Ukraine the green light to use its most devastating weapons deep inside Russian territory. Or at least that's what Russia wants you to believe. With Ukraine liberating a lot of Russia's Kursk Oblast from Russia and the battle in the east of Ukraine heating up, Kyiv has begun to request free use of America's most powerful weapons inside Russia itself. And Russia is terrified of this happening. On August 27th, the Kremlin made the announcement that it was clarifying the wording of its doctrine on the use of nuclear weapons, allegedly to give more, quote, clarity. This announcement came as Ukraine seems to have reached the limit of exploitation in its invasion of the Kursk Oblast, launched new incursions into Belgorod, and has been pressuring international allies to give it the green light to strike at military targets deep inside Russia. While Putin was more than happy to allow Ukraine to kill Russian conscripts en masse and seize territory inhabited by mostly lower-class Russians, it's the thought of American weapons striking deep into Russia that spurred him into action. The specific weapons in mind are ATACMS and other Western-supplied missiles such as Storm Shadow and potentially an unannounced American long-range strike missile. For 2 years, Kyiv lobbied for these critical weapons in order to defend itself from Russian aggression, and it only started receiving them in April. These proved highly effective against Russian formations and facilities inside of Ukraine. ATACMS famously made its debut by destroying a large number of Russian attack helicopters in one strike, driving the Ka-52 attack helicopter further down the endangered species list. But Ukraine has had one major problem, which Russia has happily exploited. The Ukrainian military is fighting with one arm tied behind its back. Unable to strike across its border into Russia with Western weapons, time and again Russia has exploited the West's fear of escalation to stage troops and equipment from the safety of its border regions with Ukraine. Combat aircraft frequently launched sorties from right outside Ukrainian territory, and supply convoys were free to gather before crossing the border and dispersing. Ukraine needed to break Russia's ability to exploit the border as it pleased, and it took a near catastrophe to gain permission to start doing that. In May, Russia launched its predicted summer offensive, with a massive troop concentration of between 30,000 to 50,000 personnel ready to assault the city of Kyiv. They made easy initial gains, with Ukraine putting up little resistance near the border regions. The city was in serious danger of falling, a crippling tactical and morale loss which might have swung the tide of the war irrevocably in Russia's favor. The key to stopping the assault was striking Russians in their staging areas, right across the border, where men, equipment and supplies were being gathered with no fear of retaliation, Russia counting on Western self-deterrence to protect them. In a move that surprised the world, President Biden secretly gave the green light for use of American weapons in the border regions, expanding their use to any area near the Russian-Ukrainian border being used to mass troops or stage equipment. This has hard limits, and Ukraine couldn't strike deep into the Russian rear as it needed in order to win the war, but it was a start. In one blistering barrage, hundreds of GMLRS rockets smashed into Russian formations. ATACMS missiles did the job they were originally designed to do: deliver 472 pounds, 214 kilograms of high-explosive democracy right on top of Russian heads, inside Russian territory. Total casualties remain a tightly guarded secret, but what is known is the Kharkiv assault faltered due to the lifting of firing restrictions across the Russian border. Later, when Ukraine launched a special military operation into Kursk, this army grouping was originally believed to be the force Russia would use to counter the Ukrainian invasion. The fact that it didn't strongly signals that casualties from the fighting on the border were extensive. It's becoming increasingly clear that among the many objectives of the Kursk invasion, chief amongst them was to break the taboo of Russian nuclear threats. Since the beginning of this conflict, Vladimir Putin has been threatening the use of nuclear weapons as a way to deter the West from providing support to Kyiv, and it's worked wondrously. For over 2 years now, Western leaders have carefully deliberated each and every bullet sent to Ukraine, weighing its military value versus the risk of making Putin mad and him lobbing a nuke at someone. Heavy restrictions were placed on Ukraine's use of Western arms, and physical limits were even made via modifications to some weapons to keep Ukraine from firing them deep into Russia. Meanwhile, Russia was, and continues to be, free to use North Korean and Iranian ballistic missiles and drones anywhere in Ukraine that it wants to. The irony of Russia being able to strike anywhere it wants with its allies' weapons, but Ukraine not being able to do the same with its allies' weapons, isn't lost on an increasingly embittered President Zelensky. Yet Western media faithfully amplified the Kremlin's nuclear threats at each and every opportunity, doing the job of deterrence for them. Even now, with the ultimate taboo broken, the West continues to debate if Ukraine should be allowed to use Western weapons inside of Russia, taking out the supply depots and airfields deep behind the front lines that it needs to if it's actually going to win the war. Right on cue, Russian President Vladimir Putin once again rattled the nuclear saber, with announcements via Russia's foreign minister and Slavic Uncle Lurch, Sergei Lavrov, that Russia would be clarifying the wording on its nuclear doctrine. Unless that clarification is, we won't use nuclear weapons because we know the West has better ones, and theirs probably all work because Private Conscriptovich didn't steal all the copper wiring out of them, then this is once again another bit of fear-mongering. Or is it? Could Russia actually be ready to use nuclear weapons, and why hasn't it yet? Even before the war in Ukraine, Russian nuclear doctrine was clear. It would use nuclear weapons in defense of the homeland, or if the existence of the Russian state itself was at risk. This is very unambiguous, and part of why the West has taken over 2 years and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian casualties to warm up to the idea of allowing strikes into Russian territory. With the invasion of Kursk, though, many are wondering where the Russian nuclear response is, or if it might come at all. After the stunning success of the fall 2022 counterattack by Ukrainian forces, many feared that Putin was being driven to the use of nuclear weapons out of desperation and to avoid embarrassment. The 3-day special military operation was over 6 months old at this point, and Russian casualties were extreme. The massive convoy to Kyiv had been a military embarrassment the likes of which history books haven't seen since possibly the Second World War, and to add to the sting, the introduction of just 24 American HIMARS to the war resulted in disproportionate losses on the Russian side. Poor training and even worse doctrine has led the Russians to centralize their supplies, making them easy targets for Ukrainian HIMARS strikes all across the front and creating one hell of a fireworks display. Command posts were likewise poorly disguised and created close to the front lines until dozens of senior Russian officers were permanently retired during GMLR's bombardments. As France's President Emmanuel Macron had famously said, Putin must not be humiliated, but humiliated he had been. The world braced for the worst. Unable to cope with even a tiny number of advanced NATO weapon systems, it was widely feared that Putin would reach out in desperation for the use of tactical nuclear weapons. These strikes would have little military value given how low the yield and how widely dispersed Ukrainian forces were. Russia would have to lob dozens of them to achieve any significant battlefield effect. Plus, all of that fallout would just flow to Russia on prevailing winds. A few nuclear detonations on the front lines would have been the end of all Western support for Ukraine. Except America's President Biden had something to say about that, something that scared Putin enough to disregard the idea altogether. It remains unknown exactly what was exchanged between the two sides, but it is known that an American military delegation spearheaded by the Secretary of Defense met with their Russian counterparts, with Secretary Lloyd Austin laying out the exact response from the United States if Russia dropped a single nuke. While the specifics remain unclear, it's now believed that President Biden has warned that the first instance of a nuclear weapon being used would result in the US military carrying out a conventional strike to destroy the unit responsible for launching the attack. The second use of a nuclear weapon would prompt an American military strike against Russian forces in Ukraine. At the time, it was believed that this would have been the sinking of the Black Sea Fleet. A third strike would prompt a wider conventional campaign against all Russian forces currently engaged inside of Ukraine. The details remain secret and likely will for many years to come until this war is well and truly over. But President Biden had made it clear to President Putin, if you launch a single nuclear weapon, the Russian Federation's military would face the full might of American military power. Washington's warning to the Kremlin was backed up by strong signaling from Beijing deterring Russia from the use of nuclear weapons. President Xi remains a silent ally to Russia, providing untold amounts of low-level but still critical military aid to the Russian military, such as vehicles, body armor, and ammunition. Xi needs Russia to win in Ukraine because a successful Russia ties up NATO military power in Europe and prevents it from deterring his own plans to annex Taiwan by force and intimidate China's regional neighbors into concessions of valuable maritime claims. But Russia using nukes is a hard red line for China. Even India, which has been happily buying up cheap Russian gas, has warned Putin away from the use of nuclear weapons. Neither nation wants to be tied down even more than they already are to a global pariah state, significantly harming their own foreign relations and global standing. But will Putin actually listen when there's signals that growing desperation is driving him towards the nuclear option? Many were surprised when nukes didn't fly over the Kursk invasion, yet this would have made little sense as Ukrainian forces were widely dispersed and Russia would just be nuking itself. Likewise, a nuclear attack into Ukraine would have made little sense unless a large number of weapons were used, or one with a very high yield, likely against a target like a city, in order to intimidate Ukraine in the West. For over 2 years, the thought of a Ukrainian military incursion into Russia spurred thoughts of nuclear Armageddon from across the West, let alone an invasion spearheaded with Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Given everything that Putin has to lose if he does resort to nukes though, unleashing them over a Kursk invasion simply doesn't make any sense. The territories liberated by Ukraine are largely strategically meaningless except to serve as a buffer zone, with little economic value and filled with Putin's least favorite Russians, poor ones. Well, that's kind of a misnomer because poor Russians are actually Putin's favorite type of Russians. It's poor Russians who he can't recruit to fight in Ukraine that Putin doesn't care about. The Kursk invasion doesn't even threaten any supply routes or disrupt any logistical or military bases supporting Russian operations inside Ukraine. Aside from the embarrassment of being invaded more successfully by the people you are trying to invade, the Kursk operation has little overall direct military value, certainly not worth using nukes over. To clarify a point though, the Kursk invasion has been a massive success with very real strategic value, spurring new aid packages from Ukraine's allies, breaking the taboo of Western weapons being used inside Russia, and forcing the Kremlin to figure out how to protect its border and limit further invasion with a military already stretched too thin for major combat operations inside Ukraine itself. The Kursk invasion has been a strategic coup. It's just that the part of Russia it captured poses little military cost on the Kremlin and can't be compared to the seizure of valuable military targets such as bases and airfields. What might be worth using nuclear weapons over though, at least in Putin's mind, is reinforcing the now broken taboo of Western arms being utilized inside Russia. If there's one thing that scares Putin, it's the thought of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles raining down on valuable military targets deep inside Russia. Given the difficulty in stopping Ukraine's drone campaign against extremely valuable economic targets throughout Russia, such as oil fields and processing plants, the Russian military is in no position to try to also defend its military assets against long-range attacks. These sorts of attacks could have a very real impact on the war. While Ukrainian drones have caused damage to Russian aircraft, a volley of ATACMS packing thousands of pounds of good old-fashioned American high explosive could significantly degrade Russia's fleet of strategic aircraft. What aircraft survive would be forced to launch operations from even further away to keep them out of the reach of Western weapons. This would directly translate to a massive slowdown in Russian air operations, giving the Ukrainians badly needed breathing room. In July, Ukrainian forces in some parts of the front were experiencing as many as 50 glide bomb attacks a day. Russian fighter aircraft would face the same damage and risk, pushing them further away from the fighting as well. This would open up a big hole in the sky for Ukrainian strike and fighter aircraft, leveling the playing field significantly and creating a big opportunity for Ukraine's newest piece of Western kit, the F-16 Fighting Falcon. These aircraft, despite being older models, are still a massive leap ahead in capabilities for the Ukrainians and pose a significant threat to even Russian fighters. With the skies contested, Ukraine could use these aircraft to launch sophisticated Western munitions that are more than capable than what its Soviet-era aircraft can carry, with great battlefield effect. A ground offensive by Ukraine is also back on the cards. In 2023, Ukraine's summer offensive stymied by vast defensive fortifications, minefields, and Russia's air power. Take away Russian air power though, and Ukrainian tanks and IFVs can operate with much more freedom, while Ukrainian aircraft can provide the frontline support that Russian forces have been enjoying for most of this war. And this is why Putin is once again rattling the nuclear saber, because losing the air advantage from strikes on airfields and the significant damage that could be inflicted on Russian ground equipment and logistics could end up with him losing the war. Even worse, massive strikes deep inside Russia would bring the war home to the average Russian in a way that the small-scale drone campaign, even if very successful, simply can't. This threatens to further sway support from a population that is already reaching high levels of war weariness and disillusionment in Putin's promises. But will Putin cross this hard red line? Almost certainly not. If Putin truly intended to use nuclear weapons, then he would simply do so. The latest announcement by Sergei Lavrov that Russia's nuclear doctrine was being clarified is simply another attempt to scare the West. Russia is very much the boy who cried nuke, another example of, no guys, this time, I'm for real, and the type of behavior you'd expect from a schoolyard bully backed up into a corner. It's not just an embarrassing display, it's a signal of just how weak Russia is and how much it fears Western military power.